In the early 13th century, Rome was not the giant metropolis people often imagine. Many estimates place its population at roughly 35,000. If that figure is even roughly right, the entire city could have fit inside the Colosseum for a single gathering, assuming the building had remained intact. But it did not. By then, the great amphitheatre had already begun its slow collapse, turning into a broken ring of stone that gathered weeds, wildflowers, and drifting soil. In places it looked less like a monument and more like a ruin that had grown its own garden. The Colosseum still carried echoes of older spectacles, and in the imagination it continued to shelter the ghosts of beasts and crowds long gone. By the 13th century, the Colosseum was also loaded with prophecy. A saying had hardened into popular certainty. As long as that structure stood, Rome would stand. If it finally vanished, Rome would vanish too. And with Rome, the wider world would follow. This kind of fear was not abstract, it shaped how people watched the ruin. When the ground shook, eyes turned toward the Colosseum as if its stones were a gauge for the stability of history itself. In 1231, a notary and chronicler from the region recorded an earthquake so long and severe that it seemed to last for weeks upon weeks. He described land trembling around the town near Monte Cassino, clear fountain water turning strange colours, bell towers dropping from churches, and houses and towers cracking or falling. He wrote of terror spreading across a wide belt of central Italy, pushing people toward repentance and flight, and inspiring barefoot processions ordered across monastic lands. And he singled out a detail from Rome that carried special weight. A massive block of stone, shaken loose, was thrown down from the Colosseum. That one fall mattered, because the Colosseum's condition was being read like an omen. Its stones were not just rubble. They were watched, counted, and interpreted. Yet the same ruin that frightened people with symbolism was also treated with blunt practicality. Noble families used it the way a later age might use a half-collapsed fortress built into a cliff. The broken walls could be occupied, blocked off, and defended. In the middle of the century, a monk from a Cistercian background was living in a house built into the Colosseum itself, sharing that unlikely home with his grandmother. Nearby, the struggle for control over the monument shifted from one powerful clan to another. A long-established family that had once dominated the site gradually lost its grip, and a newer family rose in its place. Rome's ancient shell was being absorbed into the private geography of medieval power. From inside the Colosseum, the new holders could stage a grand story about themselves, even claiming heroic ancestry and borrowing prestige from the deep past. The ruin gave them more than a name, it gave them leverage. From there, they could watch roads leading to their rural estates, protect routes that fed their wealth, and position sons for advancement in the papal court. Their daughters might be placed in convents nearby, contained within the same network of stone, kinship, and influence. The Colosseum, half garden, half fortress, could hold a whole portrait of 13th century Rome. Ancient grandeur turned into medieval real estate, legend and poverty pressed into the same cracked masonry, the sacred and the opportunistic living side by side. But the Colosseum was only one example of a larger pattern. Across the city, classical Rome survived as a skeleton that the medieval city wore like armour or used like scaffolding. On the Celian Hill, for instance, part of an old aqueduct line once built to carry fresh water from far countryside, still stood as a ruined ark of stone. Near that structure, during the last years of his life, a religious founder lived in a way that seemed almost designed to symbolize the era. He belonged to one of the new orders of the age, groups that had emerged at the edge of the 12th century and flourished in the early 13th. His story was shaped by devotion and by action, an inner call towards solitude, paired with a mission directed outward toward human suffering. The details of his early life are not completely secure, and later, retellings tend to romanticize him, but the outline is clear enough. He was thought to have come from southern France and to have studied in Paris before becoming a priest. A vision during his first Mass was said to have set his course, convincing him that he was meant to help rescue Christians held in captivity in Muslim lands. At the same time, he was pulled toward the older ideal of withdrawal and prayer, and for a time he sought seclusion in the countryside. Eventually, a new religious community took shape around him, approved by papal authority and organized for a practical purpose, raising funds to redeem captives and then caring for the rescued in hospitals. Although ports on the Mediterranean played an early role in that effort, he ended up in Rome again. There, a house and a small religious complex grew around the remains of the aqueduct line, near an ancient arch and an older monastery. It was a striking image, a holy man living inside the bones of a watercourse, a recluse set in the middle of a city, prayer and administration fused into a single life. The aqueduct no longer carried water the way it once had, but it still supported life in a new form, becoming part of a place where the poor were sheltered and the vulnerable were treated. In that sense, the broken engineering of the classical world was repurposed into a channel for medieval mercy. A third image of the same city could be found not in a fortress or a hermitage, but in a market, near the ruins of an ancient theatre, where old stone had become the foundation for family strongholds, and within the remains of a portico once rebuilt by an emperor, a church managed the space in a way that blurred sacred property and everyday commerce. The site became the heart of Rome's fish trade, and the bustle of buying and selling gave the area a hard, lively energy. Antique marble, once part of a monumental complex, was now simply material, something that could be rented out, reused, and worn down by ordinary hands. Here too the pattern appeared. The medieval city stitched itself into the ancient one, using the past as infrastructure for the present. This habit of living inside old Rome went beyond the obvious monuments. Churches carried names that attached themselves to arches and ruins. Families identified themselves by the landmarks they lived beside or within. Ancient titles and fragments of classical identity drifted into everyday naming, as if the city's long history had left bits of vocabulary on the streets. The boundary between inherited prestige and ordinary residence could feel thin. In such a setting, an ancient monument was not simply a backdrop. It could be an address, a shield, and a claim. Encircling all of these reused ruins were the great walls of the city, built in late antiquity and later expanded, repaired, and sanctified with Christian symbols. Medieval Rome lived within those walls, but it did not occupy the entire enclosed space in a dense urban spread. The area inside was enormous. Much of it was thinly inhabited, broken up into small farms and gardens, vineyards owned by religious institutions, scattered churches and basilicas, and the towers and fortresses of dominant families. The most crowded neighbourhoods clustered more tightly in a particular zone on the eastern side of the river, between key bridges, with smaller inhabited pockets across the water in Trastevere and in the Vatican area. Even within the same walls, Rome could feel like two cities at once. A compact hive of streets and noise alongside a quieter landscape of cultivated ground. A chronicler's description of a later papal death captures the compressed intensity of the dense city. News moving fast. Rumours spilling through alleys, sound bouncing off tight corridors. Wailing rising as if the streets themselves amplified grief. That kind of tight urban atmosphere has not vanished entirely. In parts of modern Rome, beneath later buildings, the older city still lies like a buried crust. Workrooms, storerooms, vaulted spaces and patched walls reused again and again. some narrow passages still keep a stubborn, medieval irregularity, slipping away from the straightening logic of later planning. The ground itself sometimes hints at the layers below, with streets swelling and dipping over centuries of debris and rebuilding. In a few places, the difference between today's surface and older surfaces is visible, as if the modern city was simply laid on top of an earlier one and never fully erased it. The other Rome, the one made of vineyards and fields within the walls, survives less clearly. It can be sensed in certain heights, in fragments of open space, in the way some corners still feel unexpectedly rustic at the edge of dense neighbourhoods. But much of that agricultural Rome has been absorbed into a more uniformly urban landscape, and what remains can easily look like romantic scenery rather than the practical working ground it once was. Neither of these Romes existed in isolation. The city's relationship to the world outside was complex, and it did not depend only on pilgrimages or on spiritual authority. The papal court itself did not always remain in Rome. It moved, sometimes for safety, sometimes for politics, turning other towns into temporary capitals. A cluster of regional centres became deeply connected to the machinery of the church. People from those towns and from Rome followed the court. Clerks, craftsmen, merchants, servants, suppliers. In the opposite direction, Roman nobles anchored in city fortresses, held estates and palaces in smaller towns, and commanded rural territories across central Italy. Monasteries based in Rome controlled lands and rights far beyond the walls, even within other communities. A truly realistic map of Rome in this period would not stop at the city gates. It would stretch outward along routes of property, obligation, and personal alliance, forming overlapping networks that tied the city to its region like threads. Inside the walls, other divisions shaped daily life. The Tiber separated neighbourhoods, but also connected them through bridges, ferry points, river traffic, and shared markets. The river created an island that carried an older association with healing, and along its banks were landings, mills, fisheries, and busy zones guarded with jealousy. The city's famous hills mattered too, though not always in a purely geographic way. The number 7 carried symbolic weight, and symbolism often mattered as much as physical reality. Certain hills retained a special presence, particularly where political memory or family power concentrated. Beyond natural features, Rome was structured by hard, man-made geometry. Ancient masonry and medieval additions formed a city of resistant volumes. Walls, towers, cloisters, fortified houses, and enclosed courtyards. Religious complexes introduced measured squares and rectangles into a street network that was often irregular and crowded. In a dense city, this contrast between order and disorder would have been dramatic. Carefully proportioned cloister spaces could feel like calm architecture placed deliberately within chaos, shaping how people moved and how they imagined authority. Even without imposing uniform planning, the city had pockets of disciplined space that projected control. In this period, Rome was also divided into districts, commonly counted as 13. These divisions sometimes mattered for voting or civic organisation, though the extent of their formal precision is hard to reconstruct. In many documents, the district label seems less like an official category and more like a convenient way to identify where someone lived. People used it casually, like naming a street or a hill. Some districts carried double names, reflecting older layers of identity, and the line between a district and a smaller neighbourhood unit was often blurred. The terms themselves were not always fixed in meaning, and the same person might be described differently in different records. It is easy to imagine these districts as colourful teams competing in festivals or contests, the way later cities sometimes dramatised their neighbourhoods. If more evidence survived for medieval games and rivalries, a vivid picture might emerge. But what remains in the record suggests something quieter. The districts were real, but they were not always emotionally charged. Their significance often shows up indirectly, through patterns of work and trade. Certain areas leaned towards certain occupations. Fish sellers concentrated near the river market, merchants clustered where shops and workshops crowded together. Yet even here, the boundaries were not clean. A foreign merchant community might sit around a central monument that stood at the meeting point of multiple districts, making the map of daily life messier than the map of administrative labels. One district in particular, Trastevere, has sometimes been imagined as a semi-separate city across the river. But in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, it does not consistently appear in sources as isolated in that way. People from Trastevere could be described simply and straightforwardly as citizens of Rome, with no suggestion that they belonged to a different civic world. The Hospital of Santo Spirito emerged under the energetic direction of Pope Innocent III, who linked it to a new religious movement dedicated to charitable care and hospital administration. He established an elaborate annual religious ceremony centered on the hospital, transforming it into a major spiritual and social center. During this event, an important relic associated with the suffering of Christ was carried in solemn procession from St. Peter's Basilica to Santo Spirito. The ceremony combined spectacle and charity. Large numbers of the poor received monetary gifts intended to provide bread, wine, and meat, while the Pope and his clergy celebrated a solemn mass and delivered sermons. The gathering was designed to nourish the body, the soul, and the mind at once through food in sacrament and instruction. The event also encouraged public generosity and offered spiritual rewards to those who participated. The religious meaning of the ceremony was carefully constructed. The charitable work of the hospital was symbolically linked to biblical themes, presenting acts of mercy as transformations of human suffering into spiritual renewal. The presence of sacred images and rituals reinforced the connection between divine compassion and practical charity. The institution embodied a distinctly medieval vision of faith in action, where devotion was expressed through direct service to the needy. Located near the river between the Vatican and the city, the hospital stood as a visible expression of this union between spiritual belief and physical care. Its position along the Tiber also became central to later stories about its foundation. By the late Middle Ages, a powerful legend circulated that the Pope had been inspired by a troubling dream in which fishermen pulled the bodies of abandoned infants from the river. Whether or not the story reflected historical events, the hospital's earliest regulations suggest a strong concern for vulnerable children. Abandoned infants were to be cared for and raised within the institution, while poor pregnant women were welcomed and assisted. Women seeking moral reform could also find refuge there during sacred periods of the Christian calendar. Special provisions ensured that newborn children would be sheltered and protected, revealing the hospital's commitment to both physical care and moral restoration. Yet the hospital's mission extended far beyond the care of children. Its rules required members of the institution to search the streets of Rome for the sick and destitute, bringing them back to receive treatment and support. Upon arrival, patients were expected to confess their sins, receive communion, and then be tended with daily care. The rhythms of religious life structured the institution's charitable work. When the bell rang for meals, members of the community were expected to serve the poor without delay. Religious services were also brought directly to those too weak to attend them. The hospital's dedication to the Holy Spirit emphasized that spiritual inspiration should guide practical acts of compassion, merging physical service with religious devotion. The ideals promoted by the institution were expressed not only in spiritual practices, but also in its material presence. Documents related to property and finances reveal the hospital's extensive involvement in the urban landscape. These records show a complex reality that sometimes contrasted sharply with the lofty ideals proclaimed in sermons. Toward the beginning of the 14th century, city officials were forced to intervene after complaints about unsanitary conditions near the hospital. Areas close to its buildings had become dumping grounds for refuse, creating foul odours and raising fears of disease. Investigations eventually revealed that the neglected land belonged to the hospital itself, marked by boundary stones bearing the institution's distinctive emblem, a cross that symbolised its authority and identity. This emblem appeared not only on buildings and property, but also on official seals and the clothing of the hospital's members. Surviving administrative records allow a detailed glimpse into the surrounding neighbourhood. They describe houses, gardens, streets, and marketplaces, identifying residents and recording rents and property boundaries. These documents reveal a lively urban environment in which local life unfolded alongside religious activity. Yet the hospital's influence was not limited to its immediate surroundings. Like many medieval institutions, it developed networks of property and relationships that extended far beyond its central location. Its members came from distant regions, and its holdings spread across the countryside. The institution's true centre was not simply a physical place, but the administrative chamber where revenues were collected and managed, linking distant lands to a single organisational structure. Within this complex environment, daily life could be turbulent. The hospital's regulations reveal concerns about discipline, order, and moral conduct. Members were instructed to respond carefully to threats such as heresy or disease and to maintain proper relations with powerful visitors. The institution guarded against becoming entangled in commercial or financial activities that might distract from its mission. Detailed rules governed the behaviour of residents, addressing everything from disputes and violence to issues of sexual conduct. Public acts of penance were prescribed for serious offences, reflecting a culture in which discipline was both visible and communal. Servants and workers were subject to particularly strict enforcement of rules. Theft, violence, and insubordination could lead to severe punishments, carried out openly within the institution's grounds. Such measures were intended to protect the resources dedicated to the poor and to maintain order within a large and complex community. These dramatic scenes, when they occurred, would have been witnessed by pilgrims passing nearby, creating a striking contrast between the ideals of charity and the harsh realities of institutional life. Although Santo Spirito played a central role in its district, it was not the only example of a distinctive medieval neighbourhood in Rome. The Aventine Hill preserved one of the most visible concentrations of 13th century structures, marked by the dominance of the Savelli family and their architectural legacy. Fortified walls, family tombs, and clusters of religious buildings shaped the character of the area, giving it a clear and recognisable identity. Among its prominent institutions stood the monastery known as Santi Bonifacio e Alessio, which still occupies the hill. From certain viewpoints, especially across the river or from distant rooftops, its silhouette evokes a sense of timeless isolation, suggesting continuity with its medieval past. Despite its appearance of enclosure, the Aventine was far from self-contained. The monastery possessed extensive lands surrounding its buildings and stretching down toward the riverbank. Its holdings included gardens, fisheries, and estates that extended across the city and into the countryside. These properties generated income and resources that sustained the religious community. Agreements recorded rents paid in money, produce, and goods, revealing a network of economic relationships that connected the monastery to many regions. Fish from the river, wine from vineyards, and agricultural products from rural estates all flowed toward the institution, illustrating the breadth of its influence. In medieval Rome, asking who lived here and how sounds like the kind of question that only famous names could answer. Chroniclers loved to follow popes, diplomats, and the loudest, noble families. But 13th century Rome leaves another kind of trail, one that slips past the grand narratives and heads straight into daily life. Not through diaries or intimate scenes at the dinner table, but through paperwork, leases, sales, inheritances, rent agreements, and the constant movement of houses, gardens, vineyards, mills, and rights, from one hand to another. These documents rarely show someone eating chickpeas or pouring wine, yet they reveal something almost as vivid: how households were built, how neighbourhoods mixed together, and how tightly family and property could be stitched into one knot. The ordinary Roman does not appear most clearly as a personality. The ordinary Roman appears as a party to a transaction. A deed might record the sale of a narrow house, a strip of garden behind it, a share of a vineyard outside a gate, or a slice of income from a mill. The language is legal, but the implications are social. One repeated pattern is the multi-generation household. A home was often not a neat unit containing a couple and children. It could hold a widow, adult sons, daughters, grandchildren, and the unavoidable relatives by marriage. In-laws were not background figures. They surface everywhere in the records because their consent mattered, their rights mattered, and their future claims could threaten any deal if they were ignored. Rents show how the city and countryside fed each other. Within the walls, payment was often in coin: small yearly sums, fees for permission to sublet, or lump payments for fixed terms. Outside the walls, the logic could shift toward produce. Wine appears constantly, not as a luxury, but as a routine currency. Grapes, oil, grain, beans, bundles of firewood, and even wax could function as rent. A monastery might demand a measured share of each harvest, rather than money, and tenants might owe delivery straight into a cloister, as if the countryside were being poured into the city through contractual funnels. These agreements also show how simple ownership could be vertically, yet tangled horizontally. In many places, there were not endless layers of landlords stacked above tenants. Often, there was one main owner, or, at most, two steps, an institution holding the ground rent and a tenant holding the usable house or plot. But the lateral complexity could be extreme. Reversions were common. Someone might hold property for life, then pass the use to a son, while reserving another life interest for an older relative, and adding a condition that if the family line failed, the asset would transfer to a church or monastery. Such clauses were not rare. They were normal tools for managing uncertainty in a world where death, remarriage, and minor children could rearrange everything. Women and minors stand out in these papers, sometimes more than modern assumptions would predict. A widow could be guardian of children and manager of a family share. A mother could give consent for a sale, not as decoration, but because her rights could block the transfer if she opposed it. Children appear with careful labels, some counted as minors, some treated as just old enough to act, and some in intermediate categories where guardianship and consent overlap. Even when legal custom was less favourable to women in certain types of tenure, the daily practice of property management still pulled women into the centre of negotiations, especially where inheritance and guardianship were involved. Joint ownership is another constant. Inheritances were frequently kept together rather than cleanly divided. A single plot might be held in shares by a cluster of relatives across several branches, and the moment someone tried to sell, the family tree had to be explained on parchment. That explanation can stretch across generations. Grandparents, dead sons, surviving widows, remarried mothers, grandchildren with guardians, cousins holding different fractions, and one branch suddenly represented by a monastery or parish that owns a share alongside the blood heirs. The result is a portrait of family not as a sentimental unit, but as a legal organism, bound together by shared possession as much as by shared meals. This kind of evidence also rebuilds the map of the city from the ground up. Every transfer needs boundaries, so each deed names neighbours, streets, lanes, churches, towers, gardens, walls, and unnamed heirs next door. A shoemaker might live opposite a famous monument while sharing a boundary with a notary and the tower of a noble house. A small house might sit against the back wall of a monastery precinct, with a public road defining the fourth side. The city that emerges is not neatly separated by class. It is layered. Skilled workers, scribes, merchants, and aristocratic fortifications appear side by side, sometimes within the same block. Witness lists underline the same reality. A nobleman can stand next to a butcher, a scribe next to a smith, a local next to a foreigner, all signing the same act. Even the ground beneath Rome appears in the contracts as something active and promising. Many leases include a clause about discoveries. If valuable stone or metal is found, the find must be shared between tenant and landlord. The wording varies, but the idea is consistent. Rome is imagined as a place where the earth itself contains profit, where digging could uncover iron, lead, or some other useful material, and where the rights to what lies below must be settled in advance. That single clause says a great deal about a city built on ruins, where building, gardening, and repairing walls could easily become accidental excavation. Property in 13th century Rome was also not limited to land and buildings. Rights could be bought and sold. Time in a mill, shares in equipment, access to a resource. A mill in the surrounding countryside might be divided by days of the week, with different owners holding different slices of its output. And the agreements often include protection clauses against the realities of the region, floods, warfare, and the sudden destruction that could make income vanish. These are not theoretical concerns. They are written into the terms because they happen. After reading enough of these transfers, the city feels repopulated. Gardens return behind houses that are now vanished. Small vineyards reappear in places that later centuries paved over. Forgotten churches and minor shrines rise again as landmarks, because deeds depend on them to define location. And along with the places come the people, the shoemakers, the notaries, the craftsmen, the widows managing inheritances, the guardians signing for minors, the neighbours identified only as the heirs of someone dead. The documents do not show laughter or arguments in the kitchen, but they do reveal the crowded reality of shared living, shared ownership, and shared obligations. A vivid trace of Rome's returning taste for greenery, and of the family networks bound up in landholding, comes into focus through a cluster of records tied to a well-known campaign of property recovery in the 1270s. An inscription kept today on the Capitoline Hill recalls how Pope Nicholas III, early in his reign, expanded Vatican buildings and soon after laid out a newly defined open space, a fresh garden precinct that functioned as a kind of protected green margin beside the papal complex. Contemporary narrative sources add small details that make the project feel tangible, including the creation of a fountain. Later writers treated the episode as a turning point, as if the city had suddenly rediscovered landscape design after centuries of neglect. The reality was more practical and more demanding. Reshaping the Vatican precinct meant assembling a patchwork of small holdings, buying up strips of vineyard and tiny farms pressed against older fortifications and service structures attached to the papal residence. Those purchases created a rare moment when two different Romes confronted each other directly across a negotiating table. On one side stood the machinery of the papal administration. Financial clerks trained to calculate revenue, notaries who formalized every clause, and a floating population of officials and dependents who lived by paperwork and proximity to authority. On the other side stood Romans whose wealth was measured in suburban plots, families who lived within the dense city and owned productive land beyond it. The sellers were not rustic labourers rooted in the soil, but urban people with farms as assets, a pattern that fits the economy of a city where land just outside the walls could be held like a savings account. The sales themselves followed a rhythm that repeats across the documents with almost ritual regularity. First came the formal appearance at the Vatican, where the principal seller presented himself before a chamber official and declared the sale, often in the presence of witnesses drawn from the curial world and, sometimes, from the circle of other sellers waiting their turn. After that public act, the process moved back into the city. A clerk, accompanied by a notary and witnesses, would go to the seller's residence to secure the consent of the people whose rights mattered under law and custom, especially wives, mothers, and other relatives who could later dispute the transfer. The effect is cinematic. The transaction begins under the shadow of the papal court, and then continues in courtyards, doorways, and streets, where domestic life shaped property ownership as much as signatures did. As the weeks passed, the pattern repeated with different faces and addresses. Men from districts near the river and the bridge approaches, from busy commercial zones and older civic centres, came forward to sell their suburban vines. Their households then appeared as the paperwork walked across Rome. Consent given by a wife at a family house, by a mother at a threshold, by a daughter represented through a guardian, by relatives gathered into a single living arrangement that did not always match modern ideas of a nuclear home. The records show extended families clustered together under one roof or within one compound, even when the family possessed multiple holdings elsewhere. They also show something else with unusual clarity. The people who owned these vineyards often lived far from them, and their relationship to the land was financial and legal rather than agricultural. Some plots were modest, others surprisingly valuable, yet the sellers consistently appear as city residents, with social ties and occupations that belong to an urban setting. The same paperwork that maps family consent also allows glimpses of the buildings those families inhabited. Long-term leases appear, sometimes structured across generations, suggesting a stable urban tenancy market. Descriptions of houses and districts north of the ancient centre, near the routes leading toward the main northern gate, reveal construction that could be bluntly functional. Walls might be packed from earth and rubble, reinforced with rough plant materials, sometimes capped with tile. Some structures sound closer to sheds than grand residences, and some were built beside or above dugout cellars that served as storage or shelter. At times, there were lofts, a tower, a lower room used like a basement, yet even these elements sit inside a cityscape where the most common luxury was access to reused stone. Across Rome, the old city's debris became a building supply. Marble blocks and columns surfaced everywhere, embedded in walls or repurposed as door frames, steps, boundary markers, and structural supports. This constant recycling gave medieval Rome its distinctive texture. Intensely urban, irregular, patched together, and always in dialogue with its own ruins. A particularly rich view of that texture comes from the records of the Orsini, a powerful family whose archives preserve the daily mechanics of buying, dividing, merging, and defending property. The family multiplied into branches and sub-branches, and the need to distribute holdings among relatives led to repeated cycles of partition and reconsolidation. Some members pursued aggressive expansion, using money drawn from office and influence to tighten control over strategic urban zones. For them, the old centre was not a romantic ruin field, but a practical arena filled with sites that could be turned into strong points and income streams. Their urban reach formed an uneven chain that stretched from the fish market district near the ancient porticos, past squares and narrow lanes, toward the bridge approaches leading to the fortress by the river and the road into the Vatican quarter. The properties they gathered suited a dual purpose. Ruins, towers, and high points could be fortified and defended. Perfect terrain for the feuds and armed rivalries that were a recurrent feature of elite life. Scattered among those defensive assets were shops, storage rooms, rental houses, and tenements that produced steady revenue. In this blend, conflict and commerce were not opposites. Defensive architecture protected income, and income funded the maintenance of walls, guards, and alliances. The fit between the family and the built environment was so tight that it becomes hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. Among the Orsini zones, the area near a small square tucked against the curve of an ancient theatre stands out as especially evocative. The place still exists in the modern city, but in the medieval records it appears as a knot of ruins, lanes, and contested ownership, shared among neighbouring families and church institutions. Leases there involve not only ordinary dwellings, but a strange mix of structures: old, rounded ruins, hollowed spaces, built-over cavities, new towers planted into ancient fabric, and adjoining residences that leaned against this composite mass. The legal descriptions are dense, yet they convey an image of a landscape where destroyed fortifications and ancient remains blended together, riddled with usable voids and topped by new construction meant to dominate the surrounding streets. Boundaries were defined by public roads, by lanes leading toward nearby churches, by the small square itself, and by gardens owned by neighbouring families, whose names recur like landmarks. This was not an isolated example. Similar bundles appear elsewhere in the Orsini material. Complexes of tower, oven, garden, and houses occupied by craftsmen. A single property holding a shoemaker in one unit, and a smith in another. Larger compounds described with kitchens, stables, porticos, defensible gateways, and architectural details that suggest a place both lived in and prepared for violence. Some documents even include practical rules for dividing such properties among heirs, addressing not only walls and heights, but mundane necessities, such as drainage and the management of waste. The city of nobles and the city of labourers overlap in these pages, without embarrassment. A fortified residence might share walls with a shop front. A tower might rise above a cluster of rented rooms. A grand name might appear beside a tenant's trade. Elsewhere, the records introduce additional fragments of the same world. A ruined tower with a granary at its base. A walled lot near a church. A cluster of houses with neighbours identified by religion and occupation. A lodging house with a named resident, and a chain of holdings passing between families and ecclesiastical landlords. The surface of Rome emerges as crowded and mixed, its spaces divided and recombined through sales, dowries, and leases, each act recorded with precise language that still carries the feel of alleys, steps, gates, and doorways. A few late medieval houses remain standing in the city today, not entirely stripped of their age, and they help translate the documents into a visual language. Brickwork alternates with fragments scavenged from older buildings. Ground floors often open into shop spaces beneath living rooms above, a layout that feels like an unbroken continuation of the ancient city's practical habits. Certain arches recur across neighbourhoods, embedded in walls or spanning passages, holding later structures aloft. In a few restored clusters, tall houses suggest how vertical medieval life could be, stacked above streets that doubled as corridors of trade and movement. Near the Capitoline area, towers still show the marriage of antiquity and medieval rebuilding, and in some places reused stone is so blatant that the act of recycling becomes part of the building's identity. A particularly revealing portrait of an urban micro-world comes from the early 14th century, a few years after the papacy moved away from Rome. The case survives because of a contested inheritance inside a wealthy family rooted near the main bridge to the fortress and St. Peter's. The dispute required detailed descriptions of the family's holdings. A warehouse, a workman's shop in the fish market zone near the ancient porticos, vineyards outside the gate by the river meadows, and a chain of properties close to the bridge itself. In that zone appear walled gardens, rented land held under church authority, tenements edged by the possessions of major basilicas, a small square shaded by a pergola, access to the river, and a water gate that linked the neighbourhood to the Tiber's traffic. A tower with a garden beside it anchors the list, but it is the adjoining residence that draws attention. A large colonnaded house with upper rooms, chambers, and enclosed garden space, positioned at the bridge foot along the road that led toward it. Yet the same description insists that grandeur and everyday commerce were physically fused. The grand residence was stitched to shop fronts and workshops, spaces associated with scribes, artisans, a widow connected to a local trade, a repairman of shoes, a saddler, a pruner, and a goldsmith. The entire block reads like a hive built beside water, where elite women and working tenants lived in close proximity, separated less by distance than by walls and doors inside a single connected complex. The scene also hints at continuity. Later palaces in Rome, though dressed in Renaissance stone and formal symmetry, often kept within them the older habit of mixing high-status households and income-producing rentals. The structure of urban life could remain medieval even when the facade became modern. After this point, the surviving evidence changes character. Earlier centuries reveal noble districts and institutional property with clarity, but the daily movement of a neighbourhood becomes harder to catch in the act until the mid-14th century, when a notary's books preserve a flood of transactions around the fish market and its church. That later record must be handled carefully. By then, the popes had been absent for decades. The city had suffered political upheavals and public violence, and the memory of recent civic revolts hung over the streets. The Rome of that notary is shaped by a different atmosphere than the Rome of the high medieval papacy. Even so, the later documentation pulls scattered earlier fragments into a single, moving picture. It shows that the medieval city did not simply doze inside its ruins. Activity was brisk, small-scale, and persistent. Buying, leasing, pawned goods, wine sales, disputes arbitrated, rents collected, property lines argued. The city's decline was real, yet it was not pure stagnation. In fact, the absence of the papal court may have made ordinary commerce more visible, pushing local figures to the front of the stage. And economic records from the early 14th century, including inventories of urban properties held by large religious orders, suggest vacancies, reduced rents, and income losses that confirm a downturn well before the plague. Those numbers undermine any fantasy of a sudden economic bloom that would make earlier Rome look sleepy by comparison. Instead, the later neighbourhood scene appears intense, partly because less else competed for attention. In that mid-century neighbourhood, one prominent local figure stands out: a wealthy legal scholar with extensive family ties and a web of rented houses clustered around named gates and passages. His possessions included valuable books, the kind of private library that marked status and professional power. He managed rural grazing rights, arranged inheritances, and served as advisor and arbitrator in disputes that linked distant districts. His household also participated in the everyday trade of the neighbourhood. A servant might purchase wine stored in a neighbour's vats, not for private consumption, but to be resold across town in a marketplace far from the river, evidence of commercial circuits that crossed empty or half-empty stretches of the city. Alongside such figures, older noble families remained present. The Savelli, seated against a massive ancient structure adapted into a fortress-like residence, still cast a shadow over the market area. Their involvement appears through formal sales of property clusters spanning multiple districts, including shares in places where vegetables were sold and where money changers operated. Other transactions reveal more direct contact with the material economy. Property that included a butcher's working space or a building designed for holding animals located under noble houses. The detail matters because it cuts against romantic images of aristocratic life. The great families did not float above the city's smells and trades. They owned the ground where the trades happened, and their walls rose beside the pens and stalls that fed the neighbourhood. Older dynasties that had once dominated the area had not entirely vanished either. Members of those families still appear as tenants, clerics, and minor property holders, woven into the same streets. Yet the people most constantly in motion in this riverside zone were the fish sellers and their households. Their business depended on specific pieces of stone, the ancient marble slabs set in front of the church, where fish could be displayed and cut. These stones were not casual accessories. They were valuable assets owned by the church's canons and leased out under long terms, sometimes with provisions that favoured inheritance through male heirs. The language used to describe them resembles the language used for shops, vineyards, and fields. A half stone could be priced like real estate. Privately owned stones could be part of dowries and could move between relatives through gifts and sales, binding family strategy to a single slab of marble. Fish sellers and fishermen appear everywhere in the paperwork of medieval Rome, especially around the district that revolved around the great fish market. Their names surface as witnesses, debt settlers, renters, and middlemen, as if the city's daily rhythm could be measured by the movement of fish and money. A borrower on one bank can be traced to a lender on the other, and the river becomes less a boundary than a corridor. Deals are struck in churches and beside church walls, not because trade is pretending to be sacred, but because the same spaces serve both purposes. In one transaction, fishermen from a coastal town accept a cash deposit from a Roman fish dealer and promise to deliver their catch in the usual way. Other fishmongers stand by as witnesses, including men tied to the legal world through family or neighbourhood connections. The market works like a network. Boats, river landings, church precincts, and shop counters all feeding into a routine system of supply. The river itself is treated as an asset. A fish pond or fishery in the Tiber can belong to a church, and a tenant can lease it for a term of years, paying not only coin on a holy feast day, but also a fixed portion of the catch as rent. Even the details feel practical and specific, down to the kinds of fish demanded and the season when payment is due. This is a city where institutions do not only bless and bury, they also own, rent, and enforce. A church can be a landlord, a regulator, and a landmark all at once, and the people who work in the fish trade move through this institutional landscape with familiarity. The records also refuse to erase women. Wives, widows, mothers, and grandmothers are woven into the same legal fabric as the men. Guardianship plans are written out in advance. If a father dies, the mother is named as caretaker of the children. If she dies first, the task passes to an older relative. Objects appear that make the world feel immediate. A ring, a chest, household goods that matter, because they are property. Even enclosed religious life shows up in the same pages, with nuns named plainly among the buyers, renters, and heirs. The impression is not of a society that keeps women out of formal life, but of one that constantly requires their presence because inheritance, consent, and guardianship cannot function without them. In the heart of the fish district, commerce is literally built into stone. Specific slabs of marble are assigned as selling places, treated almost like rentable counters. A single stone can have a known history, a recognized owner, neighboring stones held by other families, and a street in front where the trade faces the public. These stones sit against church walls under painted images that remind anyone passing that Rome is also a city of visible devotion. The market does not erase the church, it lives beside it. Clergy handle matters that are unmistakably religious, while also dealing with the practical administration of space, rent, and rights. Even in death, the language of neighbourhood business can creep into final wishes. People leave money for repairs to major basilicas, for lamps burning before images, and for nearby shrines that matter because they are close to home. And yet the neighbourhood is not sealed off. The people tied to the fish market move across the city, to courts, to other districts, to gardens tucked unexpectedly among dense streets, to other fisheries along the river, to major churches beyond their immediate parish. Their charitable gifts scatter across many shrines, suggesting a web of loyalties that extends far past a single street. At the same time, the cast of characters is broader than the dominant trade group: merchants, goldsmiths, butchers, millers, clergy from different churches, foreigners who have settled in Rome, and newcomers from nearby towns all enter the scene. The fishmongers form the core, but the background never stays empty. The city's economy forces contact. The river is a milling river as well as a fishing river, and that single fact brings another workforce into the same orbit. When the question turns to how closed Roman neighbourhoods really were, the Jewish community makes the issue sharper than any other example. In 13th and 14th century Rome, Jews commonly lived in identifiable areas, but not behind the walls of the later system that would be imposed centuries afterward. The later enclosure belongs to a different age. Earlier, Rome shows something else: a recognizable concentration without a sealed prison. That does not mean comfort or equality. Prejudice, pressure, and legal disadvantage can still shadow daily life, and religious politics do not help. The period is full of hostility toward minorities across Western Europe, and Rome is not isolated from that climate. Yet the evidence also makes clear that Jews are not living outside society's normal mechanisms. Jews can hold property, rent houses, appear in court, draft wills, and even serve powerful patrons in professional roles. A Christian landlord can rent to a Jewish tenant in an ordinary transaction witnessed by a priest, handled without theatrical language, treated as routine business. Court cases illustrate the same point. Disputes over drainage, dyes, and street conditions can involve Jewish artisans and Christian clergy, judged by civic authorities who order practical solutions, rather than staging moral drama. A workshop can be condemned not for the religion of its owner, but for the mess it pours into a public street. The verdict might require a covered channel leading to a sewer, and the matter closes like any other urban nuisance complaint. The rules of the street apply, and the city expects compliance. The location of the Jewish quarter shifts over time. Earlier settlement across the river does not vanish overnight, and traces persist in later documents. New synagogues are built after catastrophe, commemorations are formed, and place names anchor memory in the city's geography. Bridges become symbolic markers because they connect neighbourhoods and carry people back and forth. The movement feels gradual, practical, and linked to urban opportunity, more than to a single dramatic decree. The later romantic image of a sinister, enclosed quarter belongs to later observers and later buildings. The earlier neighbourhood reads as part of the working city. Alongside religious and ethnic clustering, Rome also forms neighbourhoods by craft. Certain zones gather people who share a trade. Leather workers and dealers in hides in one area, those who crush ancient marble into lime in another. These craft districts are not just ideas, they leave fingerprints in place names and in the density of people with similar work appearing in nearby contracts. Rome's ruins feed this economy too. Ancient stone is not only admired, it is cut, burned, repurposed, turned into building material and dust that supports new construction. The medieval city does not sit politely on top of antiquity. It uses it, reshapes it, and makes it pay rent. In one stretch of old Rome, the memory of buying and selling still clings to the street map. For centuries, this was the kind of area where a traveller from the north could wander between stalls and workshops, and where church names once preserved the trades that shaped daily life. Only a few of those names still feel legible today, but older Rome was full of them. Churches and lanes that carried the echo of marble workers, chalk sellers, candle makers, key makers, rope makers, chain makers. Even a tall medieval bell tower, still standing and elegant, quietly points to the craft that once defined its corner, marking a place known for barrel makers. Many of these labels reach back so far that their true beginnings are impossible to pin down. Streets shifted, routes were renamed, and the same word could migrate across the city. A famous example is the old main thoroughfare that in the Middle Ages gave its name to the long, central avenue of Rome, only to become attached later to a much smaller side street, beside a church that kept the earlier designation. Yet the habit of naming places after trades remained revealing. It shows that Romans thought in terms of craft clusters, pockets of the city where a particular kind of work was expected to concentrate. At the same time, the pattern was never absolute. Even in the 13th century, alongside whatever concentrations existed, every neighbourhood still contained a scatter of occupations, just as modern cities do. Down by the lower right bank of the river, the character of a district could be read almost immediately. This was the shipping zone, where boats and cargo belonged to everyday scenery, and where sailors naturally formed a recognisable local world. Their presence becomes visible in late 13th century legal inquiries into the long shadow of maritime violence. Piracy, seizures, abductions that had disrupted lives, property, and reputations. Men from this riverside quarter appear in formal settings before officials, speaking with the confidence of people whose work was shaped by shared roots, shared dangers, and the dense rumour network of waterfront life. It feels like a neighbourhood with its own accent and memory, tied to the river and to the wider sea beyond it. Food trades created their own geography too, and meat was a category with special weight. Not far from a powerful noble stronghold, in a zone that had once been part of the ancient civic centre, a major butchering market operated in the 13th century. The place carried a vivid nickname, and the scale of business there can be sensed in a single surviving sale. More than 100 sheep and a dozen goats changing hands in one transaction. The scene forces a correction to any purely romantic picture of medieval Rome. A tower associated with political struggle and elite violence did not stand in noble isolation. It rose over the practical world of slaughterhouses and market traffic, surrounded by the steady work required to feed a crowded city. The drama of arms and feuds coexisted with the everyday drama of livestock, knives, and dinner. Across the surviving records of the period, there is a constant surge of working people, artisans, labourers, and skilled specialists of every kind. Among them, certain professions stand out because they carried literacy and legal authority: doctors, notaries, judges. They formed a kind of skilled middle layer, useful in a city that could be politically unstable and necessary for an economy that relied on contracts, disputes, leases, and inheritance. Their names appear everywhere because they were required everywhere. A notary might be present at a land sale, a house lease, a dowry settlement, a lawsuit, and then again as a witness in a completely unrelated agreement. These professionals did not exist apart from the broader population. A judge could come from a family of craftsmen. A notary could be the son of a man who worked with his hands. They could also be property owners themselves, holding vineyards outside the gates as investments and leaving substantial assets to their children. Physicians, in particular, fit naturally into the life of 13th century Italy, where medical learning had deep roots and where the realities of disease pressed hard on urban populations. Rome's summers could be brutal. Fevers spread easily in a city with polluted water, shallow wells, and swampy edges, and the river that carried trade and fish could also carry sickness and death. Floods made the danger worse, tearing at bridges, filling streets with filth, and leaving grim high water marks. In such a place, doctors were not a luxury. They were part of the city's basic survival system, and their services were sought eagerly, sometimes desperately. Italian towns competed for competent physicians, offering privileges to attract them, and Rome's demand would have been constant. In a city where rumour could elevate a fever specialist into high favour, medicine had prestige as well as necessity. The social reach of these doctors was wide. Some held administrative roles connected to church government. Some owned suburban land like the notaries did. They lived beside ordinary tradespeople and shared the same cramped urban space. A doctor might have a neighbour who stitched shoes or sold spices, and a physician's name could even become attached to a local landmark. The city's professional class did not float above daily life. It was embedded in it, moving through the same streets and participating in the same property economy. Lists of neighbours and witnesses in legal records create a crowded panorama. Shoemakers and innkeepers appear beside clerics. Cooks and smiths turn up in the same lines as minor nobles. Water carriers, comb makers, spice sellers, tailors, cloth workers, warehouse keepers, painters, millers and money handlers all move through the documentation, as naturally as if the city itself were stepping forward to be counted. Famous artists are glimpsed indirectly through sons and assistants. Skilled craftsmen appear in administrative spaces, not just in workshops. The impression is not of neat separation by class or quarter, but of constant contact. A trade label might mark a street, yet the people of that trade still lived among others, owned property far from their workplace, and engaged in deals that had nothing to do with their craft. For all this visible activity, one striking absence remains. Clear evidence of strong, well-defined craft guilds in 13th century Rome. In the age when guilds were rising across Europe, Rome appears oddly quiet. A few older and powerful trade bodies existed, especially those tied to cloth and those connected to agriculture and provisioning. By the early 14th century, a more elaborate hierarchy of major guilds can be identified, dominated by the older organizations. Political reformers are said to have consulted guild leaders, and merchants and ship owners had acted collectively in earlier centuries during diplomatic and commercial crises. Later, historians have tried to push the origins of various guilds back into the 13th century. Innkeepers, bakers, builders, shoemakers, doctors, but the documentary footprint remains faint. Aside from the cloth trade, most of the guild landscape looks less solid than one might expect from such a busy city. The cloth merchants, however, do stand out with clearer institutional presence. They can be traced to a market zone near the civic centre. and they appear meeting in a specific church that served as a kind of corporate anchor. By the middle of the century, they seem to have exercised control over related branches of the textile trade, supported by rules that regulated behaviour, leadership, disputes, and charitable obligations. The surviving statutes are complicated and not always easy to date precisely, but they reveal a lively commercial world. They describe shopkeepers managing customers with strict etiquette, one seller guiding a buyer from dim interiors toward better light, rivals forbidden to interrupt, comparisons discouraged, poaching prevented. Behind these rules sits a recognizable marketplace mentality, competitive, hungry, opportunistic, kept in check by cooperative regulation designed to protect profits and reduce conflict inside the trade. Outside that sphere, the weakness of guild structures becomes harder to ignore. The city was full of artisans and commerce, yet its corporate organizations seem underdeveloped compared with other major Italian towns. The explanation lies in what made Rome different. Rome was not simply a commune growing through manufacturing and export. It was the name capital of a vast religious government whose court moved and whose presence could swell or drain the local economy. It was also the primary pilgrimage magnet of the Western world, a place where travellers arrived in waves and money arrived with them. Much of the city's income depended on people who did not stay. In that environment, rigid civic trade structures mattered less than flexible, opportunistic systems that could absorb sudden crowds and sudden absences. The pilgrim economy left vivid memories. In the Great Jubilee year at the turn of the century, contemporaries described rivers of visitors so dense that counting felt impossible. Accounts speak of crowds pressing day and night around the major churches, of money pouring in so steadily that it seemed to need to be gathered like grain. Stories circulated of people being trampled underfoot, of travellers crushed by the pressure of bodies, of the most sacred spaces becoming physically dangerous when relics were displayed. A visiting monk from England was caught in one of these surges while trying to see a famous relic, suffered a catastrophic injury, and never made it home. Such episodes were not simply dramatic accidents. They were symptoms of a city periodically overwhelmed by its own attraction. Local authorities understood the darker side of this economy. The profits were immense, and so were the temptations. In the 13th century, measures were taken to protect pilgrims from coercion by innkeepers in the Vatican area. Reports reached the city leadership that lodging owners were forcing travellers into their houses and even dragging settled guests out of other hospices to claim them as customers. The resulting regulations insisted that visitors had the right to stay where they chose and buy what they needed from whom they wished. Fines were imposed on violators, and the revenue was directed toward religious institutions and public works. An attempt to turn private greed back towards civic and spiritual maintenance. Travellers themselves recorded the shape of the market. Food could be relatively affordable, even in peak seasons, but lodging and fodder for horses became painfully expensive. The city could supply bread, wine, meat, and fish in large quantities, and observers sometimes described this abundance in almost miraculous language. Yet no one doubted that the crowd enriched the Romans. The city's economy was built, in part, on selling to outsiders, on booths and stalls clustered around sacred sites where devotional items were marketed beside ordinary services and snacks. Pilgrims could buy painted images of famous relics, pick up small metal badges stamped with apostles' faces as proof of their journey, and hire practical help in the same spaces where they prayed. And the pilgrims were only one part of the transient population. Less fleeting, but economically just as decisive, were the officials, clerks, advocates, accountants, and servants who moved with the papal court. When these people were present, rents rose and local demand surged. When they were absent, whole neighbourhoods felt the loss. Rome, in other words, was not shaped primarily by the steady growth of a manufacturing economy that naturally organised itself into guilds. It was shaped by motion, by seasonal waves of devotion, by the arrival and departure of a court, by the constant monetisation of sanctity, and by a city population trained to profit from the world's traffic through its streets. When the papal court returned to Rome, the city could change mood almost overnight. The Curia did not arrive alone. It pulled in a moving crowd of legal agents, church representatives, and professional petitioners who carried disputes and requests from distant places and placed them in front of the papal administration. Some came for a single decision, some stayed for months, and many followed the court wherever it settled next. Rome, in those seasons, was not only a city. It became a switchyard for the business of Latin Christendom. Behind the petitions came households. Powerful bishops travelled with staff, servants, advisors, and guards, often functioning like small embassies. An archbishop-elect arriving in Rome might find the city between popes, with cardinals scattered between safer hill towns and the capital itself. A visitor could discover that influence was reachable, but money was not. Credit that worked in one commercial world might fail in another. When a traveller's financial letters were refused by the bankers linked to the court, the problem was not embarrassment. It was paralysis. Credit had to be rebuilt, contacts reactivated, and plans rewritten. These crises shaped movement. People rushed out to find cardinals elsewhere, then returned again when rumours shifted, waiting through long months of uncertainty until the papacy finally produced a new pope. During those pauses, foreign entourages swelled the living population of Rome, especially in the already crowded quarters, drinking local wine and renting rooms at high pressure. Similar households spread across the other papal towns too, forming a chain of temporary capitals where lodging, food, and services became a sudden industry. Even that is only part of the gravity of the court. Where high clergy went, trades followed. Butchers, poultry sellers, and other suppliers attached themselves to the travelling machine because the court and its followers had to eat well and eat constantly. Bills were settled through proctors and agents who kept accounts, paid for meat and game, and managed deliveries. These tradesmen appear not as colourful background, but as working components of the system. Their addresses change with the court's itinerary: Perugia, Orvieto, Rieti, Viterbo, and back again. Witness lists and contracts become a map of papal movement, a list of towns that hosted the Curia, a record of economic tides. When the court moved into Rome, the city tightened and filled. When it moved away, the same streets could feel slack, with fewer mouths to feed and fewer coins circulating. Against that shifting mass, the settled residents can seem almost faint. Garden owners, shoemakers, and ordinary tenants are still there. But the scale of the court makes the rest of the city look like scenery. To rulers, that may have been convenient. A quiet crowd is easier than a demanding one, as long as it applauds on cue. For the papacy, the city often functioned as a ceremonial stage, and Rome's greatest public meaning could be expressed not in debates, but in processions. The routes themselves stitched the city together, tying neighbourhoods into one long ribbon of ritual movement, making the streets declare that the city belonged, in practice and profit, to the authority of St. Peter. One of the most dramatic scenes of this kind took place during a great church council early in the 13th century, when representatives from across the Western world were present, directly or through proxies. During that season, the papal court crossed the river to a venerable basilica in Trastevere to perform a solemn act of consecration. The destination mattered because of its story. A miraculous flow of oil was believed to have signaled the birth of Christ, and the church carried that legend as part of its identity. The ceremony turned the crossing into theatre. Nobles in splendid dress led the way. Clerics and lay followers came behind in a dense human stream. Children joined with olive branches and repeated chants, as if the city itself had been drafted into liturgy. In Trastevere, lanterns hung on cords in such number that they seemed to compete with daylight, while banners swung from towers and house fronts. That route can still be imagined in the mind, even when the city has changed. The river haze, the island, the hill beyond Trastevere, and the sudden opening of streets into small piazzas still preserve a trace of the old movement. Inside the basilica, the wall images show another kind of continuity. An older, formal world placed above a newer, more active one. The earlier style presents enthroned figures with calm, fixed gravity, arranged as if the divine order is meant to be read like a sentence. Below, later panels shift towards scenes of human life. Gestures, domestic details, animals, and landscapes that appear drawn from observation. Yet the apparent realism can deceive. Many of these motifs are inherited patterns carried through long traditions, reshaped and recombined rather than invented from nothing. The result is not a break with the past, but a reuse of it. The city did something similar. Rome repeatedly took what was visible from earlier ages and turned it into a tool for its own time. Processions were not limited to papal ceremonies. Rome filled its calendar with them. Annual routes from major basilicas, royal entries staged with deliberate grandeur, public receptions that tried to turn politics into spectacle. Chroniclers loved these moments because they offered movement, sound, crowds, and the chance to portray the city as a living organism. When a powerful foreign ruler entered Rome, the river itself could become part of the performance, with ships pulled upstream by force and ceremony. Large crowds turned out, mixing clergy and laity, old and young, while nobles performed mounted games and musicians filled the streets. Yet the same chroniclers could describe a second entry for a rival figure with even more luxurious detail, emphasizing not only music and cheering but the decoration of the route itself. Cords were stretched across streets from house to house. Rich textiles and shining objects were hung so densely that the path became a corridor of fabric, fur, and glittering stone. The description reveals something practical beneath the wonder. Rome was a city used to cloth, value, and display. A place where luxury goods were not abstractions but part of commerce and status. The greatest repeated procession remained the one that carried a newly crowned pope from one end of the city to the other. It linked two monumental centres that each claimed a kind of supremacy. The basilica guarding the relics of the chief apostle, and the cathedral complex that served as the Pope's principal seat. The route ran from wall to wall, forcing the city to present itself as a single ceremonial instrument. The procession was layered like a moving hierarchy. Banners, crosses, officials, advocates, singers, bishops, archbishops, and the cardinals in their ordered ranks, until the Pope appeared last, elevated, surrounded by a small cluster of attendants and symbols of authority. Along the way, the crowd was paid in coin at set points, and the city's participation was partly purchased, partly compelled, and partly desired. It was sacred theatre mixed with civic routine. The route itself passed through contrasting zones: dense commercial neighbourhoods, river crossings, fortified points, older monumental spaces, and stretches where ancient ruins still dominated the skyline. The procession moved beneath the shadow of arches and towers, past broken imperial structures reused for medieval needs, then onward toward the great cathedral precinct. The The ceremonies at the destination included actions that could appear strange even to contemporaries. Gestures meant to dramatize humility and elevation. Public sayings that sounded pious while sitting awkwardly beside the wealth and power on display. The point was not subtlety. The point was to turn authority into a sequence of visible acts that the city could witness and remember. This ceremonial life existed alongside another rhythm: seasonal cycles, the stubborn repetition of plants, birds, and weather that returned every year regardless of who ruled. Wildflowers brightened hillsides and riverbanks. Caper plants clung to stone and bloomed again. The city's ruins were not silent. They were covered by growth, warmed by sun, and threaded through with ordinary movement. 13th century Rome was built on old surfaces, but it never stopped being a place where nature returned and life continued. Festivals added a different kind of timelessness. Some customs were loud and physical, involving public games held on a hill made from shattered ancient pottery jars, or races and contests staged in a great open space shaped by older architecture. Religious seasons blended with carnival habits, and the authorities sometimes struggled to control the crowd. Distributions of charity could be overwhelmed by aggressive revelers. Forcing reforms meant to separate genuine poverty from rowdy opportunism. On the days of major games, the city's leaders might appear, and the festivities could include elaborate symbolism that turned animal killings into moral lessons about restraining desire before Lent. The beasts were paraded through streets under red cloth, and then destroyed as a kind of public sign that the season had changed. Other traditions hovered between city and countryside. Sayings about weather, practices meant to ward off misfortune, rituals against envy or the evil eye. It is difficult to date these precisely. Some formulas feel older than the documents that preserve them. Others were likely shaped by later centuries and then projected backward as if they were eternal. Like old walls patched with new brick, the folk material is composite. A single verse can carry layers of time that cannot be separated without specialist work, and even then only the specimen is dated, not the kind. Religious enthusiasm could also turn into public performance in more formal ways. Dialect plays and street drama grew in later centuries, and eventually large religious companies staged sacred performances in monumental settings. The roots of that energy appear earlier in intense waves of devotion and in the hard edge of repression. Heresy was not absent from Rome, and the response could be brutal. Public condemnations, humiliating markers imposed on the accused, houses destroyed as a warning. At the end of the century, inquisitorial activity became visible in the city's life, sometimes aimed as much at political dissent as at theology. Popular drama and persecution can look like opposites, yet they can be twins in their simplicity, each reducing complex spiritual questions into blunt public action. Alongside processions, games, and street religion, the city shows another strength that is easy to overlook: literacy. Rome was not a university city in the way that Paris or Bologna was, but it was a court city, and the court required writing. Witness lists can include teachers of grammar without fanfare. Learned men gathered in elite households, especially around cardinals, whose residences functioned as small courts, filled with people from many regions and with varied skills. Libraries were collected at great cost. Institutions linked to the curia supported study because administration demanded trained minds. In a city where legal instruments shaped daily life and where petitions crossed the continent, writing could never be a specialist monopoly. It spread outward, creating a place where many people wrote for work, for ambition, and sometimes for ideas. A large part of medieval Rome's building fabric is hard to pin to a precise decade. So much stonework survives without clear dates that the city can feel almost outside time. Yet a small group of late 13th century monuments speaks with unusual certainty. They show not only what people of that era saw, but what they deliberately made and how confidently they blended old Roman inheritance with ideas arriving from beyond Italy, including influences carried from Venice and the Eastern Mediterranean. Even after the loss of most of the medieval Vatican and Lateran complexes, these surviving works still convey scale, polish, and a kind of disciplined grandeur that suggests a civilization capable of costly ambition and careful design. Nothing makes that clearer than the great basilica dedicated to Mary on the Esquiline. Its apse mosaic overwhelms even the skeptics. The surface is not simply decorative. It is an entire world of light. In certain conditions, when sunlight filters through heavy curtains and the gold catches fire, the scene seems to lift the building into another register, as if the architecture were filled with a solemn brightness that belongs to an imagined heaven more than to masonry. On the summer feast, when white petals fall through the air like a gentle snowfall, the effect becomes theatrical and almost unavoidable. The mosaic's power lies partly in its scale, but also in its composure. It holds together several layers of time and imagery, ancient motifs at the base with playful river figures, a central scene that was modern for its day, saints drawn from older tradition and newer devotion, vines and birds, and a soaring order of angels that stabilizes everything like a winged scaffold. The work announces its patrons and its maker, and its completion belongs to the final years of the century's last calm before political storms fractured the city's great families. It was not an isolated achievement either. Other major mosaics from the same Roman moment still survive on church facades and in the Trastevere Basilica, creating a chain of glittering surfaces that link distant neighbourhoods. In the same years, Roman painting reached a remarkable peak in fresco. One major artist of the period moved between mosaic and wall painting with equal confidence, working at a time when Roman interiors could be turned into encyclopedias of image and instruction. Some of the style looked outward, borrowing northern decorative tastes that added pointed canopies, patterned borders, and a lively sense of ornament. Yet the deeper strength of the painting lay in its return to older Roman habits of seeing. Bodies, treated as weighty and real. Animals rendered with observed movement. Colour used not merely to fill space, but to describe it. In a rural monastery outside the city, murals offered a kind of visual teaching designed for people who worked the land. Scenes that linked moral lessons to recognisable natural acts. An eagle guiding its young, a fisherman pulling fish from water, the stages of human life, the senses, an exemplar meant to instruct as much as to please. Rome, at the end of the 13th century, could still produce religious art that felt both learned and grounded, aimed at the mind without losing contact with the everyday. Back inside the city, the same painter's great Last Judgment still survives in large fragments, on the inner facade of a Trastevere church. There, the imagination of painting met the imagination of sculpture and architecture. A few years before the century closed, a major altar canopy was built that translated a Northern Gothic vocabulary into Roman stone, not as imitation, but as adaptation. Soon after, another canopy in Trastevere pushed the synthesis further, balancing Gothic vertical energy with a distinctly Roman sense of measured classicism. One detail captured the blend almost symbolically: a mounted saint high on the structure whose horse seems to connect two worlds at once, pulling the eye from the inherited classical south toward the imported northern form. The sculptor behind these works was not a native Roman, but his decades in the city shaped the look of late-century Rome more than any other carver. His career can be traced through a sequence of powerful commissions: an enthroned royal figure carved for the civic heart of the city, altar structures that framed the most important liturgical action, and later, projects tied to papal self-representation at the highest level. His workshop produced figures connected to Christmas devotion, and it likely created a bronze image of the apostle whose toe became smooth from centuries of pilgrim kisses. A piece that quietly advertises the authority of the key-bearing saint and the culture of touch and proximity that defined Roman pilgrimage. The late 13th century also left another category of monument everywhere: tomb sculpture. Rome's churches became galleries of draped stone bodies, ceremonial footwear, and solemn faces carved to hold memory in place. Some of these effigies are anonymous masterpieces, startling in the way cloth seems to fall and gather as if it still obeyed gravity. Others are less refined, but they remain important because of their density and visibility. They reveal the material reality of the curial world. Cardinals and chaplains rendered as weighty public figures, their garments translated into stone with careful attention to folds and hems, as if the fabric itself were part of the office. These monuments show how strongly the church court attracted artistic labour, drawing painters and sculptors toward the same circle that drew clerks, advocates, and accountants. Not all of the period's work reached the highest level, and that contrast matters. Some churches received redecorations that look competent, but derivative. Gothic details inserted into older buildings that could not be rebuilt from the ground up. A canopy might imitate northern forms without fully understanding them, and a family patron might stamp his heraldry across a space more loudly than the art itself deserved. Yet even the second-rate work becomes evidence of something larger: the sheer scale of patronage and production in late-century Rome. The most impressive masterpieces did not stand alone in a desert. They rose inside a dense field of commissions: altars, floors, painted ceilings, carved furniture, decorative borders, created by a city that still invested heavily in sacred space. The era also had its visual habits, repeated so often that they become a kind of signature. Starry ceilings appear again and again, as if the night sky had been brought indoors. Borders form rhythmic frames around scenes in mosaic and paint. Stylized flowers and metal fittings survive as quiet proof of the craftsmen who filled churches with finishing details. Underfoot, the patterned stone floors remain one of the most persistent medieval presences in Rome. Geometric inlays that shift from church to church yet always speak the same language of cut stone and coloured pieces. Thrones for church officials, twisted candle stands shaped by memory of faraway holy places, small tufa blocks, brick bell towers. These elements together form the baseline Roman church interior, a recognisable vocabulary that continued while the great artists layered new brilliance over it. Beyond church walls, a surprising amount of the 13th century city still holds its ground. Medieval towers rise here and there within the ring of modern sprawl. A fortress built into an ancient tomb still dominates the Appian Way, altered by later hands but unmistakably martial. An old wall associated with a powerful family still marks the city's central heights, even if rebuilt and repaired across generations. A few bridges and gates remain as working demonstrations of medieval infrastructure, standing beside ancient monuments and later additions. Considering the long history of demolitions, reconstructions, and the levelling of towers that chroniclers loved to count, it might seem unlikely that so much medieval fabric would survive at all. Yet in Rome it does, especially in the churches, where hundreds of fragments, small and large, still reach back into or beyond the 13th century. And sometimes it is not the buildings that feel most alive, but the people who seem to reappear. In one church on the Capitoline slope, a flat tomb set into patterned stone carries a figure that looks up from the floor, hands, feet, face and buttoned clothes carved in a simple style that feels almost bluntly human. The man is not a prince of the church, not a grand patron, not a monumental cardinal whose memory was designed to impress. He feels closer to ordinary life, someone with obligations, family ties, property concerns, and the modest ambitions of a city servant. The effect can be more intimate than the great sculpted tombs because it demands less ceremony. It offers a single life, not an office. Elsewhere, similar floor tombs preserve other urban identities. A fragment of another figure survives embedded in a palace corridor wall, half lost yet still oddly present. In another church, a prosperous spice seller lies carved between nave and aisle, dressed like a pilgrim with the signs of long-distance travel, as if he carried two identities at once: merchant of the city and traveller to a holy destination. Around him runs a warning sentence familiar in medieval Europe but never quite softened by repetition. The living will become what the dead already are, and the dead ask for prayer. The stone does not argue. It simply watches, reminding anyone who passes that late medieval Rome was not only mosaics and walls, not only saints and popes, but also craftsmen, merchants, servants, and the quiet insistence of individual lives fixed into the floor. Far from Rome, most people in the 13th century would never see the city with their own eyes. A peasant tied to a village economy might spend a lifetime inside a narrow radius, unable to imagine Rome's streets in detail. Yet ignorance of the physical city did not mean ignorance of the name. Rome sat in the imagination of Europe as one of the few places that mattered on a world scale, rivaled only by Jerusalem and the sacred landscape around it. Even those who could not picture Rome's walls could understand what Rome represented. Monastic communities with their wider networks knew more. Pilgrims passed through. Letters circulated, news travelled. A collapse in a major basilica could be reported as a disaster felt across seas. Learned monks wrote about Rome as a symbol of imperial greatness and decline, but they also described its gates, shrines, and martyrs' sites, trying to give shape to a city they might never visit. Some even drew plans, not because the plans were accurate like modern maps, but because the act of mapping expressed an idea. Rome as a destination where roads ended, where histories converged, where sacred geography could be imagined as a diagram. The Rome that circulated through Christendom was not a single Rome. It was a layered construction made from many Romes at once, ancient and contemporary, pagan and Christian, administrative and mystical, holy and dangerous. This composite city, the Rome of story and expectation, was often more influential than the actual streets. Part of its power came from the belief that the ground beneath it was rich with hidden marvels. Medieval people knew that old valuables could be found in the earth: hoards, buried metal, treasures kept safe under soil, and that general belief concentrated intensely on Rome. The city became a magnet for treasure legends: golden halls, sealed underground palaces, unimaginable riches left by emperors. One famous tale described a statue with an instruction carved upon it, directing the clever to strike or dig at the right spot. A learned interpreter, guided by shadow and sun, uncovered steps leading down into a subterranean court, where a silent assembly sat in splendid stillness. Gold figures, a shining stone that lit the entire chamber, a guardian with a drawn bow. Everything in the story signals the same warning. Wonder and greed are neighbours, and the moment of theft triggers ruin. The treasure becomes darkness, the visitor becomes trapped, and the moral falls shut like a sealed door. These fantasies were not disconnected from daily reality. Property contracts sometimes reserved to the landlord any gold, silver, precious stone, or valuable metal found in the ground. That clause sounds like superstition, But in Rome, it also sounded practical. The soil really did contain valuable remnants. Marble lay everywhere, not only above ground, but in fragments and deposits, and certain trades existed precisely to grind, recycle, and profit from it. The city produced a peculiar combination of the mysterious and the mundane. Legends of emperor's gold alongside the everyday processing of ancient stone into useful materials. The same layered imagination shaped how people explained the monuments they could actually see. A single equestrian statue could carry multiple identities at once, depending on who was speaking. Pilgrims might call it by one famous name, local Romans by another, clerics by a third, and learned men would insist on yet another. Even when observers tried to correct the error, they could still attach the correct name for the wrong reasons, building a confident explanation on unstable tradition. The important point is not who the statue truly represented, but what the shifting names reveal. Medieval Rome was read as a text, and different readers supplied different glosses. This habit becomes most intense where the ancient and Christian pasts meet. Medieval guide traditions often handle the contrast with a clear rhetorical pattern. An older pagan feast or temple becomes a Christian feast or church, and a single calendar day binds the transformation. A story might begin with an emperor and an old festival, then pivot to a pious imperial woman arriving with a relic, persuading pope and people to transfer honor from an earthly ruler to a heavenly king and his apostle. The same pattern appears in explanations of major temples turned into churches. The pagan building dedicated to a mother goddess becomes a Christian church dedicated to Mary. The old feast day is retained but reinterpreted. Pope and emperor act in tandem to authorize the change. The narrative structure repeats because it is useful. It makes continuity feel deliberate, and it turns the city into a calendar of meanings, where place and date fuse into memory. Alongside replacement stories, there was an even more ambitious idea: that ancient Rome had already received hints of Christianity before Christianity arrived. In this framework, a powerful emperor associated with peace and order becomes the stage for revelation. Senators propose divine honors. The emperor hesitates. A prophetic figure is consulted. Then a vision appears. A mother and child above an altar. A voice naming the scene as belonging to the Son of God. The emperor kneels. The senators marvel. The story anchors itself at a specific Roman location, connecting government and prophecy, state power and sacred foreknowledge. The result is an imagined Rome where the classical world does not merely get replaced by Christianity. It anticipates it, as if the city itself were always meant to become what it became. Taken together, these traditions create an ideal Rome that is neither fully pagan nor fully Christian, neither fully ancient nor fully medieval. It is a layered city where churches mark former temples, and ruins become stages for saints' stories, and gates, bridges, columns, and obelisks are arranged into a mental map. The arrangement can look like a jumble, but it rarely feels frivolous because the stakes are high. Rome is presented as the meeting point of civilizations, and that meeting is still visible in stone. In a city where ancient palaces could be used for contemporary political rituals, where visitors could stand at an altar linked to imperial visions, and where a mosaic could depict a legendary Roman sign of Christ's birth, the overlap of worlds felt immediate. For medieval writers, Rome was not just a city on a map. It was a language. It was the vocabulary people reached for when they wanted to describe rule that looked intelligent, calculated, and inevitable. Even authors writing about distant kings borrowed Roman tones to make a ruler's prudence sound like the wisdom of planned government. Behind that style stood a long chain of memory. passed down in broken pieces across centuries, carried through churchmen, court historians, and imperial traditions until it could be reused again. This memory was tied to places inside the city. The Capitoline Hill, above all, carried the reputation of an ancient command centre. In the medieval imagination, it was the head of the world, a place where the machinery of consuls and senators once directed the earth. Yet Rome did not need only one hill to radiate authority. The entire cityscape was treated like a field of echoes. Names from the imperial past were everywhere, repeated until they became part of the city's atmosphere. The medieval city even kept a senate and senators, though shaped in ways that no classical Roman would have recognized. Earlier centuries had tried to revive republican forms and fuse them with distorted imperial symbolism. From far away, Rome was still seen as a place that grew out of a uniquely political past, as if government itself were one of its natural resources. That sense of power did not exist alone. Medieval Rome was also a city that wanted a complete origin story, one that could explain everything at once. It inherited the heroic tradition of Trojan Rome, with Aeneas and the early kings, a story admired for both poetic and political reasons. But medieval history could not stop there. Every Christian city was expected to fit into the grand biblical timeline. So Rome's origins were reassembled into a hybrid that tried to combine incompatible worlds: the ancient Mediterranean legends and the scripture-centered map of human history. In these medieval accounts, the aftermath of the Tower of Babel became the starting point. Figures from the flood narrative were redirected toward Italy. Early builders and rulers were placed on the hills of Rome long before Romulus, long before the famous founding date. Palaces were assigned Trastevere and the Palatine. The Capitoline became the site of yet another primeval city. Then, a parade of culture heroes, river spirits, and legendary leaders arrived one after another, each building, each naming, each adding another layer. At last, Romulus appeared as the closer of the circle, enclosing scattered settlements inside a single wall and calling the whole thing Rome. The point was not precision. The point was completeness. A story that could gather all beginnings into one place. Rome's gravitational pull was so strong that even communities outside Christian tradition had to account for it. Medieval Jewish traditions also developed their own foundation legends and moral explanations for why Rome mattered in world history. The city became a magnet for competing myths. It did not lose its fables simply because it had so many monuments and so much documented past. In Rome, the real and the legendary did not cancel each other. They strengthened each other. The city's streets felt like they carried both history and enchantment at the same time, as if the place itself generated stories the way heat rises from stone. This ancient political aura naturally tempted medieval emperors. To claim Rome was to claim the appearance of legitimacy that no other city could provide. The rulers most captivated by this were those whose ambitions needed a stage as much as a strategy. One emperor in particular treated Rome like a mirror that could reflect him as the heir of the Caesars. He came to the city when young to be recognized, then returned for formal coronation, but later he attempted something larger: to persuade Romans that they were partners in his imperial victory, the people who made emperors, the human foundation beneath his power. After a major battlefield triumph in northern Italy, he acted out the idea of a Roman triumph in a very deliberate way. He sent to Rome a captured civic symbol, taken from his defeated enemies. A public trophy meant to sit on the Capitoline, as proof that the old Roman language of conquest belonged to him. He framed the gift as if it were unreasonable for Romans to be excluded from celebration of a victory he described as Roman. It was political theatre. It was also self-portraiture. Unlike monuments raised on distant frontiers, this one was placed in the city he wanted to revive, in his imagination, so that his claims could bounce back to him as visible confirmation. Later, writers used similar language for his heirs, insisting that Romans remembered their legendary bloodlines and their ancient role in creating rulers. There were even material attempts to strengthen the illusion, as when imperial authority bought properties from local nobles and returned them as fiefs, transforming private holdings into symbols of lordship and loyalty. Yet the entire project had a brittle quality. Rome's ancient political memory could earn money and admiration, but it was poorly suited to building a modern secular state in the 13th century. The city's past was valuable for guidebooks, for tourists, for pilgrims, for merchants, for craftsmen who lived from visitors and from the machinery of religion. As a political engine, it was mostly smoke. The imperial need for Rome was often psychological rather than strategic. The emperor needed to imagine himself as an old-style ruler in old-style Rome, independent of the world around him, even if the city itself no longer provided that kind of power. Any attempt to rekindle a purely civic, secular Rome did not truly take shape in Rome itself. The most serious experiments in reviving ancient constitutional ideals were more visible elsewhere in Italy, especially in the cities where legal study and municipal government were already flourishing. Inside Rome, another memory dominated nearly everything: the memory of the apostles and the claim that the city was sanctified by their deaths. Rome repeatedly presented itself as the place made holy by the blood of its chief martyrs, the two pillars of apostolic authority. In that story, their sacrifice turned pagan ground into Christian centre, and from that consecrated soil grew the power of the new Rome. This was not only rhetoric, it was also institutional reality. The presence of the papal court, even when it travelled, kept the apostolic narrative active and profitable. The court drew lawsuits, embassies, appeals, penitents, and the endless administrative traffic of the church. It made Rome wealthy through rents, services, food supply, lodging, writing, medicine, clothing, and all the trades that fed a court city. Even when the papacy resided in other towns, it was still called the Roman court. Wherever it settled, that place temporarily became Rome in function. Yet Rome remained its most natural home in this period, and the city wore the confidence of a capital because the court kept returning. The strongest treasure of this Rome was not marble or gold buried in the ground. It was relics. Rome's churches presented themselves as containers of sacred power, and the city's wealth as a reliquary turned it into a living festival calendar. On almost every day, some church could claim a fragment, a memory, a saint's bone, a cloth, a trace. Several churches might celebrate at once. The city became a grid of ceremonies, as if lights were turning on across a map in response to the date. The most intense relics were those connected with Christ. In the 13th century, Christ was not an abstract figure. The sense of his reality pressed on people through worship, through sermons, through the Eucharist understood as a direct encounter, not merely a symbol. That intimacy could deepen devotion, but it could also allow escape. People could approach the sacred presence and still avoid the harder demand of reshaping life entirely around it. Alongside the Eucharist stood other objects believed to offer vision and contact, especially a famous image associated with Christ's face, treated as one of the great treasures of the central basilica, and carried in ritual to places of care for the poor. The holy geography of the East was also relocated into Rome through imported objects and claims, so that the city could present itself as a second Jerusalem, a place where the story of salvation had been gathered and stored. This sacred collection did not remain fixed. New saints entered old spaces. New figures appeared alongside ancient martyrs in art and worship. Relics arrived from many directions, often dismembered into tiny pieces, sometimes so reduced that their identity became more an act of faith than of knowledge. Rome's churches multiplied and covered the city like a dense overlay. The Virgin, in particular, dominated the rhythm of devotion. Her feasts divided the year. Her churches stood everywhere, from the grand to the nearly forgotten. She could be attached to local miracles and seasonal legends. Stories expanded around her major shrine, describing signs in summer and dreams that guided building. By this period, those legends were not fading, they were growing, supported by indulgences, promoted by popes, embraced by major religious orders, and displayed publicly in monumental imagery. Mary also illustrates the mixed character of medieval sanctity. She was tied closely to Christ's human story and could force believers to picture him acting, speaking, and demanding concrete compassion. At the same time, she could become a vessel for vague feeling, absorbing older reverence that once belonged to different sacred figures. Her popularity could elevate devotion, but it could also blur it into soft sentiment. In Rome, that softness combined with the city's relic culture and ceremonial life to form a powerful religious atmosphere that attracted pilgrims in enormous numbers. If the story ended there, Rome's 13th century image would seem complete. Imperial memory, biblical origins, apostolic authority, relic wealth, Marian devotion, and the steady pull of the papal court. But that would miss the central paradox that clung to Rome as stubbornly as holiness did. Alongside the white gold city of relics stood a second Rome in the imagination of Europe. A dark Rome associated with greed, manipulation, poison, and fever. Against the New Jerusalem rose a new Babylon. This darker image was tied to the same engine that made Rome powerful, the Curia. To outsiders, the court looked like a marketplace where access and speed could be bought. Letters and reports from travellers are full of anxiety about payments, gifts, and hidden costs. People learned to pretend wealth or hide it, depending on what seemed safer. A visitor might arrive with ideals and leave with a new, bitter education. Rome could feel like a school where innocence was stripped away. The city that was praised as the head of the world could also be mocked as a place where plain truth and honest poverty were liabilities. The reputation spread beyond court officials. It attached itself to the entire urban experience. Taverners, lenders, merchants, and the many hands that received the foreigner's money, while delays dragged on. Rome's decay did not make it less threatening. It still felt intensely urban to people from more rural regions, and that anonymity could read as sophistication, even predation. The city could impoverish, but it could also enrich. Some arrived poor and left wealthy. The same process ran in reverse, depending on luck, skill, and connections. Then there was disease. Fever haunted the city's legend like an invisible guardian. In the warmer seasons, malaria-like sickness seemed to rise from damp ground and stagnant air, turning Rome's sacred treasure into something guarded by mists. Even famous physicians and high churchmen were rumoured to die of poison or fever. Visitors wrote of exhaustion, despair, and deaths that could not be explained cleanly. The holy horde and the corrupt atmosphere existed together, as if the gold and the cross stood inside the same fog. Out of all these contradictions, a surprisingly orderly set of patterns emerged in medieval thought. One pattern was mourning, Rome weeping over the distance between past greatness and present ruin. Another was triumph, a Christian Rome made richer than its pagan predecessor by martyrs and miracles. The third was satire, a mocking exposure of pomp and corruption, aimed especially at the court that claimed to govern the Christian world. All three patterns were bound together by a final agreement, even among those who hated the city. Rome was not like other places. It was a magic city, a city of memory and money, holiness and danger, ruins and ritual. That balanced, unstable image dominated the age just before later thinkers began to reframe Rome's meaning in new, sharper ways. Power inside any relationship is hard to pin down. Anyone who has watched families up close, or the shifting balance between lovers, knows how quickly simple answers collapse. Even after the sharpest definitions, it can still be impossible to say who truly steers, who yields, who wins. The question becomes only slightly easier when the relationship belongs to the past. The evidence is thinner, so the picture looks cleaner, but the difficulty remains. It can look simpler again when the relationship is between a community and those who claim to lead it, because a crowd's repeated gestures hide the private negotiations underneath. In large groups, people seem to act in predictable ways, fit into social boxes, and react with blunt needs and fears. That surface regularity can fool the observer into thinking control is obvious. Medieval power has often been described as if it was straightforward. Leaders command, followers obey, landlords squeeze, tenants submit. With a confident smile, it can be said that everyone knows where the advantage lay. Yet that confidence only holds in the most extreme circumstances. When workers are desperate and replaceable, when a stronghold or a weapon decides survival, when a treasury or a storehouse is the only shield against hunger. Most medieval communities did not function in such pure conditions. Rule existed, but it was tangled. Even speaking of ruler and ruled requires a kind of simplification, a deliberate flattening of real life. Once that is admitted, another point becomes unavoidable. The governed have to cooperate for domination to operate. They must, at minimum, accept it in some negative way. They must find some advantage in endurance, some small profit in stability, some protection, some habit, some less dangerous path than open conflict. That does not mean medieval politics was a hidden democracy, and certainly not a pleasant one. It means that distant authority, especially, could not simply declare itself and expect results. Without credible threats, payments, privileges, or practical benefits, orders did not travel far. This uncertainty fits 13th century Rome especially well, though Rome also had its own peculiar blend of confusion and clarity. In many places of that era, it is at least possible to say something like this town belongs to a king. That one answers to a duke. Another is an independent commune, while still remembering that each phrase conceals a mess of exceptions. Rome resists even that in perfect simplicity. Did the Pope rule it, or the Emperor, or a handful of great families, or a civic regime that spoke in the name of the people? The answer shifts with the decade, sometimes with the season, and even then the correct emphasis is mixed. Rome, in that century, sits in an odd position, unable to become a stable, self-governing commune, yet burdened with being the symbolic capital of both empire and church. In some moments, the city almost feels like an idea more than an institution, a necessary stage set built by imagination because the world needed such a place. A legendary court requires a Camelot, and the followers of the Apostle require Rome. Structures that look firm elsewhere feel strangely hazy here. Citizenship, guild power, noble rank, faction, and elections all appear blurred, as if the city's social machinery never fully hardened into a reliable form. That blur can be unsettling, but it also offers an advantage. When no single ruler can be named and no neat constitution stands in view, the observer is pushed toward more basic questions. What actually held this community together? What made decisions stick? What produced obedience or at least compliance? In Rome, there seems to be unusually little decorative political architecture to distract from the underlying forces, especially economic ones. The difficulty is that the surviving evidence is incomplete, so the exposed foundations are not always clear enough to satisfy curiosity. Even so, the city was not an illusion. Rome existed as a unit that could act. It had inhabitants who counted themselves as members of the community and others who lived there without full standing. It had nobles, courts, officials, and walls that were repaired and repaired again. It used a civic seal. It issued coinage in its own name, a small but serious claim to authority. And it mattered that the city could raise armed force. The ability to summon a militia was one of the few unmistakable signs that Rome, for all its vagueness, remained a political body. Much of the shape Rome found for itself became visible when its armed men took the field against neighbouring rivals. Conflicts with nearby towns were not grand crusades, but hard local struggles, the kind that train a community to recognise its separate interests. The Roman army itself was a mixed creation, not cleanly municipal in a modern sense. It included elements that look feudal, elements that look hired, and elements drawn from city neighbourhoods. Yet the act of mustering still mattered. It was an announcement that Rome possessed common interests, distinct from those of nearby enemies and distinct, at times, from papal priorities. In that narrow schooling of local war, this often disorganised city echoed something of the ancient Rome it never stopped remembering. Hatred for a rival town could become a civic emotion strong enough to resemble obsession. Across the 13th century, the main visible centre of civic authority was the institution called the Senate, and the men who sat in it. Whoever controlled that body gained a decisive advantage, because most municipal offices and commissions drew their authority through it. The Senate could summon troops, approve treaties, regulate measures and standards, and issue legal decisions. In that limited, but real sense, Rome was governed through the Senate. The old civic formula stamped on coins and carved in stone was not merely decoration. It was the mould through which public power tried to flow, a vessel for the idea of communal order. Yet the Senate's substance was strange. It sat between larger forces that pressed from above and the weak machinery of city administration below, and it could bend in both directions. Its size could change abruptly and dramatically. In a short span it might shrink to a single ruling figure, expand into a large body, and then contract again, as if the city could not decide what it wanted its own government to look like. The instability was so normal that official language sometimes had to include both possibilities at once, swearing oaths that assumed there might be one successor senator, or several. Even at formal moments, the institution could not predict its own shape. No description of how Rome was governed in that century makes sense without a bare outline of the political turns that repeatedly reshaped the Senate's role. A settlement reached at the end of the 12th century between the papacy and the city provided a durable but ambiguous framework. The Senate was recognised as an accepted civic institution. The city acknowledged a form of loyalty to the Pope. In return, the papal side promised support for the walls and recognised customary payments tied to civic office. At the start of the 13th century, then, the Senate seemed like a legitimate body with a place in the city's life, even if its size remained unstable, sometimes appearing as a broad council, sometimes as a single ruling senator. In the early decades of the century, the pattern settled for long stretches into a single senator at a time, then later sometimes shifted to two, then back again. Individual names matter here because they reveal the kind of power the office represented. The senator was not an anonymous administrator chosen for skill alone. He was typically drawn from a limited circle of families, whose wealth, alliances, and armed followings mattered more than the public theory. At times the papacy appears to have played the decisive role in choosing these men, sometimes by direct appointment, sometimes by guiding a public acclamation that served as the city's election. Yet even when the papacy could not have wanted the outcome, the process still does not look like a stable popular vote. The sources speak often of a crowd shouting in the civic square. That kind of gathering can approve or reject. It can erupt. It can intimidate. But it cannot reliably run a complex election without the kind of organized citizen body that seems to have been weak or undefined in Rome at this time. What remains clear is the social profile of the men who held the chair. They stood at the peak of dominant forces inside the city, sometimes aligned with papal interests, sometimes opposed, sometimes representing a compromise between factions, sometimes expressing a more tangled family strategy. However the mechanism worked, the office consistently expressed real power. After the mid-century, the story becomes more visible and harsher. A strong outsider arrived and briefly attempted to impose order in a way that resembled the stricter, communal experiments seen in other Italian cities. That period did not last. An aristocratic reaction followed, and the Senate became a stage for noble factions and papal relatives, with the chair passing between representatives of the leading Roman houses. At the same time, there were renewed attempts to hand the office to foreign rulers. In the early 1260s, competing candidates included a powerful claimant from the south and a northern prince with strong international connections. The manoeuvring around these candidacies suggests that influence could be bought and organized, that propaganda and bribery mattered, and that something like an electoral procedure existed at least enough to be manipulated. Yet the irony is sharp. The clearest hints of election appear just as the older civic model was weakening, because the Senate was moving toward domination by a stronger external force. That external force soon took a recognizable form in a ruler who combined patience, severity, and administrative efficiency. He was not remembered as charming. He was remembered as relentless. When he wanted Rome, he did not persuade it with gentle argument. He applied pressure with soldiers and ships. When he faced a rival, he removed him without hesitation. He took the senatorial role and occupied the most symbolic residence he could find, even when it angered allies who wanted him more manageable. And yet his rule, precisely because it relied on tangible force, could appear oddly effective. He treated the office as real work. His idea of government included public order and public ceremony. Even matters that might seem symbolic, like ensuring proper burial for a dead pope, fell within the duties he claimed. The city received a kind of governance it could understand. Blunt authority backed by power. This domination was never comfortable for the papacy. Popes who depended on the ruler also feared becoming trapped by him. They wanted him as a weapon against other threats, but not as a permanent master standing between them and central Italy. Negotiation became constant. Limits on how long the senatorial power could be held. Conditions about holding other offices, promises revised and reissued. Letters drafted and corrected. The paperwork of anxiety piled up. It contrasts sharply with the practical reality on the ground, where armed men could simply seize the civic centre and administer the city through deputies. When pressure forced resignation, Rome's internal tensions resurfaced immediately. Disputes flared between the city's elected leaders and papal interests, including conflicts over money and debt. Popular unrest could suddenly elevate a captain of the people, not necessarily as a democratic hero, but as a figure who embodied street power and factional organization. In one dramatic turn, a foreign noble was elevated to the senatorial role as part of an anti-dominant coalition, only to fall when wider military events turned against him. The ruler returned. Deputies governed again. For a decade, the city's public life was shaped by someone who stood outside it, yet held it firmly. Then the pendulum swung. A pope from a major Roman family reclaimed local authority and worked carefully to secure it. Agreements were reached with the emperor that clarified claims over territories. A new set of rules restricted the senatorial office from being captured by foreign potentates, while still leaving room for the Roman nobility to dominate it. At the same time, the Pope strengthened local networks by elevating familiar families and allies. In this phase, papal policy and family interest were difficult to separate, because the city's politics were built from kinship and rivalry as much as from ideology. The Senate moved back into Roman hands, passing between the leading houses in a pattern that reflected both alliance and competition. Another reversal followed with the election of a foreign pope aligned with outside power. The city's leaders attempted to solve instability by granting the office for life to the pope as a person rather than as a spiritual ruler, and then the pope in turn granted it to the same external dynasty that had already dominated the city. This arrangement did not hold. When southern troubles weakened the outsider's position, Roman factions saw an opening. A revolt struck at the heart of civic control. The civic centre was stormed, the foreign garrison was destroyed. A deputy was imprisoned, and a new captain of the people emerged, tied by blood to a major local family. The city experimented again with constitutional language and temporary reconciliations between rival houses. But the pattern of compromise returned quickly. Within the year, the papacy installed 2 senators from the great Roman lineages, a pairing meant to balance forces that could not be eliminated. Finally, a pope from one of those ruling families took the throne. He came from a house that had produced senators before, and his relatives were ready to hold power again. The senatorial office, once granted to him, was handed to his brother, turning civic authority into something almost openly domestic. The city that could not decide whether it wanted one senator or many ended, for the moment, with the simplest outcome of all: rule passing along a family line, as if Rome's grand political uncertainty always had a quiet gravitational pull toward the logic of kinship and faction. In the late 13th century, one Roman clan managed to make dominance look almost effortless. The Savelli did not rule by sheer force the way some of their rivals could. Their advantage was that they felt genuinely embedded in the city. They were recognizable, familiar, and widely tolerated, and they were not so overwhelming that every other great house felt permanently threatened. That balance mattered. It offered Rome something rare in a period of constant family tension, a form of control that could appear normal. Yet the bigger story is not simply the Savelli. Their prominence reveals the shape of power that would harden across the rest of the century. Rome was increasingly governed through a papal-centered system that relied on the Senate, but not as an independent civic engine. The Pope, acting like a lord of the city, ruled through senators who were chosen because they represented the right blend of family interests. The objective was practical: make papal authority workable by ensuring that the largest Roman lineages could live with it. Sometimes the senator came directly from the Pope's own family circle. Sometimes the choice reflected a negotiated coalition designed so that the Pope's advantage did not provoke a violent reaction from the rest of the ruling class. The arrangement could even function under a corrupt Pope, because its basic purpose was stability. Peace in Rome served the Pope's ambitions only if the city remained governable. There were moments when that pattern broke. One rupture came during a long and unsettled papal vacancy after the death of a pope in the early 1290s. With no firm hand at the centre, Rome did what it often did when the lid came off. It slid into factional violence. Trade suffered and pilgrimage traffic shrank because disorder made the city dangerous and unprofitable. For a time, there was no senator at all. and the absence itself became a symbol of breakdown. Then, suddenly, 2 senators were chosen from respectable but not incendiary noble families. A kind of emergency compromise that suggests how desperate the city was for a neutral balance. Soon afterward, a short and unusual pontificate arrived, with heavy external influence behind it. That brief reign alarmed Rome's leading houses because it hinted at a return of foreign domination. Paradoxically, that fear helped push rival Roman families into temporary cooperation, long enough to accept a new and more forceful papal figure. When the whole century's senatorial record is viewed from a distance, one fact stands out. The Senate was rarely a fixed institution. It expanded and contracted. It split, doubled, vanished, reappeared, and reshaped itself in response to events. At times it looked like a pair of ruling nobles, at other times like a larger council, at other times like an empty title waiting to be seized. It responded to popes and vacancies, to uprisings, to emperors and kings, and above all to the pressure of the city's wealthiest families. Its strength was not dignity. Its strength was flexibility. Roman government was designed to bend, because anything that refused to bend tended to snap. One of the most revealing tests of this system came early in the century, in the first years of a powerful pope's reign, when he tried to impose strong control over Rome from the start. The details of how he consolidated authority are messy, as they often are in Rome, but the core is clear. He resisted the traditional expectations of buying goodwill with money, and he tried to manage the choice of senator through intermediaries loyal to him. At one point, he even claimed bluntly that the city was under his power. That confidence was real, but it was not unchallenged. Opposition formed immediately, because Rome ran on family gravity. The relatives of the previous pope expected privilege and resented displacement. The relatives of the new pope expected rewards and created their own problems, especially when one notorious family member became a lightning rod for hatred. 2 former senators with famous names emerged as vocal leaders against papal control. They were dangerous not only because they had towers and clients, but because they could speak to crowds. In Rome, a family feud became far more explosive when it gained a temporary street following. At the same time, an external conflict with a nearby rival city flared again, and the Pope's choices in that war were interpreted inside Rome as evidence of weakness or betrayal. A treaty that seemed to concede too much could turn political tension into open unrest. The crisis that followed was chaotic, fast-moving, and theatrical. It spread in multiple directions and produced little lasting change, but it exposed how power in Rome was physically organized. The conflict revolved around towers. Towers were raised, attacked, undermined, surrounded, threatened by engines, and even challenged by other towers. The city's skyline was not just architecture, it was faction made visible. Certain towers became symbols of papal nepotism and alleged financial abuse. Others became rallying points for opposition. The struggle was, at its heart, a war of households. The core rivalry involved 2 great clans, but they were surrounded by many others whose fortunes rose and fell with the shifting winds. Older powers that had dominated earlier generations were still present, but newer families were climbing quickly, building influence through property, marriage alliances, and strategic violence. Behind personal hatred and immediate profit lay older rivalries as well, family memories that survived longer than any single dispute. The violence escalated after an attack struck at the papal faction's holdings while the Pope was away. The papal senator tried to calm things by forcing leading troublemakers into exile, splitting them to opposite ends of the city. That maneuver failed. A visiting relative connected to one of the exiled groups was murdered on the road, and the death became a political weapon. Public mourning was staged as a provocation. Funerary display was turned into a demonstration meant to inflame the city against the Pope's relatives. Grief was performed not as a private act, but as pressure. Then, a second explosion widened the crisis beyond the main family feud. A declining family with large rural holdings had borrowed heavily from the Pope's powerful brother and could not repay. A marriage arrangement was proposed to absorb the debtor family's property into the creditor's clan. The debtors agreed and then withdrew. The papal faction moved toward confiscation. The debtors answered with spectacle, trying to turn their fall into a citywide uprising. They acted out poverty in public. They staged distorted penitential marches through the streets. They disrupted major religious services at the heart of the city's sacred life. They shouted accusations and insults at the Pope in public rituals. Finally, they performed a dramatic surrender of their property to the Roman community, as if placing themselves under the protection of the city against the papal family. Their goal was to unleash popular fury and force a reversal. The strategy produced noise and violence, but not victory. The Tower War intensified, yet the papal family's position did not collapse. In time, the contested inheritance moved into the hands of the creditors anyway. The deeper irony came later when the new branch that inherited those estates adopted the identity of the land it had acquired. In the next generation, the inheritors appeared less as outsiders and more as local lords, tied to their countryside base, capable even of opposing members of their original, wider family network. In Rome, absorption could transform identity. While towers burned and alliances shifted, Rome also experimented with constitutional rearrangements. The existence of a single senator angered those who believed a larger body would dilute papal influence. The Pope attempted compromise through mediators. The city split into pro-papal and anti-papal blocs, each holding strategic ground and gathering supporters around specific churches and fortified houses. The rebels took control of an alternative meeting centre and pressed for a senatorial arrangement favourable to them. A temporary parallel authority emerged, a group presented as the community's good men, as if legitimacy could be rebuilt by naming it. Fighting concentrated around the strongholds of the leading rebel family and around the towers of their rivals. For a while, the rebels gained ground. Then their own leadership style became a liability. Allies turned cautious, and what had looked like a rising collapsed into negotiation. A larger senatorial body was briefly accepted, only for the system to slide back again toward a single senator once the Pope regained the advantage. These early century struggles sound like chaos, but they foreshadow the end of the century with eerie precision. The same families, the same geography, the same logic of fortified spaces and rival zones returned again and again. Late in the century, a pope could still describe the city as a patchwork of family-held places, a map of who controlled which fortress, which district, which route from one sacred complex to another. The political story of Rome was often the story of who could move safely between landmarks. Yet there was one major difference between the early and late crises. In the early years, the Pope survived with authority intact, demonstrating control and tactical patience. At the end of the century, a Pope could be physically overwhelmed, beaten, and trapped, an image so shocking that it can be read as the collapse of an older model of papal dominance in Rome. Even then, family fortunes did not necessarily die with a pope's humiliation. Roman power was broader than any single reign. Over the century, a tightening occurred. The Senate and the populace were not erased, but they were increasingly folded into a system that looked more like a secure lordship than an unstable commune. A jubilee year could be governed by senators from the greatest houses, experienced men whose public inscriptions still speak of authority and order. But their success depended on the Pope's project. In that moment, they were not simply civic rulers. They were the Pope's men, operating inside the framework he controlled. And still, even as the relationship became clearer, it never became fully simple. A pope could claim authority in the highest religious language, presenting himself as shepherd of the world and bishop of Rome, with special affection for the Roman people. In the same breath, he could also cite a public civic instrument, as if the city itself had voluntarily granted him lifetime rule. Divine order, local sentiment, and municipal paperwork were all used together to justify the appointment of senators. That blend reveals the true nature of 13th century Rome. Power always needed more than one explanation, because no single explanation was ever strong enough on its own. Earlier in the century, conditions sometimes pushed in the opposite direction, towards civic independence. A relatively peaceful pope could unintentionally encourage stronger local government. A pope consumed by imperial war could be too distracted to discipline the city, leaving space for senatorial confidence. In moments of urban assertion, boundary stones were set up again with old republican language, and the city spoke as if it were reclaiming ancient rights. The right to elect officials, control coinage, regulate essential infrastructure, and assert authority in the surrounding countryside. Those claims alarmed papal writers because they sounded like a city remembering itself. Then came a brutal period when a strongman effectively governed Rome during a vacancy and forced the election of a pope through imprisonment and terror. The episode was filthy, violent, and humiliating, a reminder that even sacred elections could be reduced to coercion when Rome's factions seized the leverage of a closed room. Out of this harsh experience, the city was ready for the arrival of an outsider who brought a different political language, the northern Italian idiom of commune government. That outsider came as a seasoned knight, with experience in the broader wars of Italy. He did not behave like a papal servant, and he did not behave like a tool of the Roman barons. He tried to build a functioning Roman state with its own direction. His coins, his diplomacy with neighbouring towns, and his willingness to ignore papal preferences all point to a project of civic authority. He took seriously the idea that Rome could govern itself in practice, not only in slogans. His title emphasized the people, and his reforms aimed to strengthen non-noble structures, including the organization of guilds. For the Roman aristocracy, he became a nightmare. He attacked the physical core of their power, towers. He reduced the skyline. He punished nobles in ways that reverberated across Europe because they seemed unthinkable in a city where the great families expected impunity. To supporters, he was justice made visible. To enemies, he was a hammer. When he was replaced, his successor was described as a man who courted the nobles instead, and the contrast sharpened the memory of the reformer's rule. So strong was his popularity among certain groups that his death was treated with a reverence that bordered on civic cult. In the moment when dissatisfaction returned, a popular league rose, guided not only by Roman figures, but also by a skilled foreign tradesman who had embedded himself in the city's life. The reformer was freed and restored, and the Pope's attempts to discipline him ran into the stubborn claim that Rome's communal officials possessed privileges that could not be brushed aside. Brancaleone's years only become readable as a single story if they are granted one basic quality. They worked because they were accepted as rule carried in by the people. Without that element, the sequence of events refuses to lock together. Yet it is just as easy to romanticize Brancaleone as it is to dismiss him. Later, writers sometimes painted him as the moment when civic freedom truly flowered. as if a fuller record would reveal a triumphant democracy and strong guilds, standing upright at last. The problem is that the record is thin, uneven, and strangely dependent on accounts written far from Rome. It never becomes completely clear who exactly brought him in, who exactly sustained him day to day, or which groups could honestly claim him as their own. One thing does stand out. His rise looks less like a victory engineered by guilds than an episode in which new or strengthened guild structures became part of the order he imposed. The appeal was not ideological purity. The appeal was that streets calmed down, decisions began to stick, and the city felt governable. That atmosphere of order did not come for free. Brancaleone appears to have demanded unusual terms and received them. A longer tenure than the normal rhythm of office, hostages drawn from the noble world, and a governing entourage that travelled with him in the style of other strong magistrates in Italian cities. His authority, in practice, behaved like a popular dictatorship. It relied on the energies of what can be called the popular party, but the popular party itself remains hard to define. It is tempting to imagine a disciplined civic body, a stable citizen organisation with clear membership and clear procedures. The evidence does not support that confidence. Brancaleone seems to have gathered the force of the streets, the fear of disorder and the desire for predictability, then concentrated them into a single hand. In doing so, he outperformed earlier leaders who had tried similar methods. But the achievement carries an irony. If his rule represented the high point of popular power, it also looks like the moment when that power exhausted itself. A unified commune with a taste for firm governance can prepare people to accept an even firmer master. The habits Brancaleone encouraged made the later arrival of an external strongman easier to absorb. Every attempt to understand this period is pulled back, again and again, to one stubborn mystery: the electorate. Small scraps of evidence point in different directions, and each scrap makes the puzzle more frustrating rather than less. When Brancaleone died during a campaign, the story ran that his successor was chosen because Brancaleone himself has recommended him. This successor, a relative, was said to have been elected by Roman citizens without papal approval, and the papacy protested that it should have been consulted even if the Pope were treated as nothing more than a private Roman citizen. That sounds like real election. Yet later, a different episode shows outgoing senators describing themselves not only as senators, but also as electors chosen by the Roman people, as if the power of selection had narrowed into the hands of a small civic leadership that claimed popular legitimacy. Another moment hints at bribery and propaganda surrounding a foreign candidate, suggesting that a competitive process existed, at least enough to be manipulated. Meanwhile, popes and political actors argued over who possessed the right of nomination. One side claimed the right after a certain date. Another insisted it belonged to Romans by ancient custom. Letters spoke of elections conducted as usual by a large crowd gathered on the Capitol, unanimous and harmonious, except for a handful of condemned dissenters. References to neighbourhood divisions hint that the city's districts mattered in mobilisation. And by the end of the century, a cardinal could say bluntly that no popular election would matter unless it had the backing of the dominant noble houses. The motives behind these claims are easy to read. Each speaker was trying to justify power, attract allies, or weaken rivals. What is almost impossible to see is the actual machinery they believed they were describing. Under the pressure of imperial claimants and foreign dynasties, under the money and prestige that flowed through the papal court, under the land-based strength of families whose power reached into the countryside as much as the city, a basic question keeps returning. Was there a coherent civic body that functioned like an electorate, in the normal sense? Was there a privileged group within the wider population that held recognized authority to choose rulers? Or did the city operate through a looser rhythm, where approval mattered more than selection, and where the decisive acts were performed by a few strong networks that could claim the crowd after the fact? Many historians have assumed the first answer. They have imagined that Rome must have resembled other communes, and that missing documents simply hide the proof. That assumption is emotionally satisfying, but the surviving local evidence points another way. It suggests institutional looseness, a population that could be assembled to shout consent, but not a population equipped with stable organs for complex choice. It resembles the kind of pre-modern public that can applaud, threaten, or riot, yet cannot administer elections as a routine civic procedure. The language of citizenship itself proves how slippery the categories were. The term citizen appears in the 13th century, and it clearly had meaning. A witness can be described as someone once tied to another place, and now a Roman citizen. An artisan can name himself a Roman citizen in a proud signature. The term seems to carry social weight and a sense of belonging. Yet the practical boundary is elusive. A political leader could protest the imprisonment of Roman citizens in a neighbouring town, implying that those men were a recognised group distinct from other travellers. A papal ordinance could define citizens as those born in Rome, but the definition appears indirectly, not as part of a full civic register. Other documents speak of inhabitants of the city in ways that sound more like residents than status. Later legal collections, from the next century, define citizenship very concretely for foreign merchants, where most property is held, whether there is a house of residence, whether a household lives there continuously, whether the family has been settled for years, whether there is also land nearby. Those later definitions make one thing obvious. Citizenship could be treated as a commercial privilege, tied to reduced tolls and freer trade, and it could be extended to the right kind of resident who invested deeply enough in the city. Even if this evidence is later, it reveals a logic that likely existed earlier. Citizenship as an advantage, not necessarily as a clearly bounded political class. And yet, some boundary must have existed in practice, even in the shouting crowd. A gathering called to approve policy cannot literally include everyone. It is unlikely that children were considered full political actors. But medieval age boundaries are complicated. Full legal adulthood could be treated as late by modern standards. Women would not have voted in the public square, yet women's legal and economic presence was stronger than many simple assumptions allow. Their property rights were guarded. Widows served as guardians. Consent in rural communities could be described as coming from men and women together. That does not turn the capital crowd into a mixed electorate, but it does warn against imagining a clean male political world separate from female economic power. The real point is that Rome's people was not a tidy legal corporation. It was a gathering that could be summoned, could be made into a public assembly, could approve treaties, privileges, or war plans, and could condemn a fallen leader. It could act politically in blunt ways, but its action was usually an act of assent. The summoning of these assemblies followed a recognizable ritual. Signals were used that assumed a population trained to respond. Trumpets, bells, and the voice of a herald. The people were called to the Capitoline Square to become, in formal language, a parliament. The senator needed this instrument because his authority, however real, depended on not pushing the city into open resistance. Sometimes the assembly could be used to produce an appearance of unanimity. Sometimes it could slip toward chaos. There is a telling scene from Brancaleone's period. The crowd is gathered in the customary way, and a military decision is put forward. whether to attack a powerful opponent with a partial levy or with a full mobilization. The account admits disturbance. Some men shouted and threw stones. Disorder threatened to break the performance of consent. In response, a question was framed differently. Not simply what strategy should be used, but whether Brancaleone should be allowed to act with full power against the enemy and against those who'd committed the public violence. The official record then reports that no one answered no, at least not loudly enough to be heard. Even here, the problem is obvious. If the assembly is structured so that the only safe answer is yes, then dissent has to take another form. It has to become riot, revolt, or the seizure of the civic centre. Rome had witnessed that kind of action before. A crowd described as the common people could overthrow a senator and replace him with another. In such a city, no might not be a vote. No might be an upheaval. Because the parliament was such a blunt tool, senators depended on other instruments, especially councils. Councils could absorb controversy, shape decisions, and prevent the public gathering from becoming a trigger for revolt. As the Senate shifted from a broad body to a small group, and sometimes to a single powerful figure, councils became more important as a source of local knowledge and local buy-in. When rule was held by an outsider backed by force, local council might matter less. But even then, council could be used to smooth the edges of occupation. Councils existed in 13th century Rome under different rulers and different conditions, and their size and shape could vary. A phrase often used for them can sound like it describes two distinct representative bodies, one large and one small. That may sometimes have been true, but the language also reads like a flexible formula used to describe a full meeting and a narrower meeting without strict constitutional precision. The senator summoned those deemed appropriate. A glimpse of how these councils functioned appears in a treaty proclamation during a moment of political fragility. The senator issued a public agreement with other cities in a setting presented as customary. A sizable council was gathered in the church associated with civic meeting, called together at the senator's mandate and at the request of a visiting official. The list of councillors is revealing. Professional men appear, judges, scribes, notaries. Great family names appear in clusters. Ecclesiastical connections appear beside noble ones. The assembly looks like a cross-section of Rome's effective leadership, rather than a broad electorate. The purpose was not only advice. The purpose was weight, a public guarantee that the treaty carried backing strong enough to hold. Not every council is described as unanimous. In another case, civic leaders, under heavy clerical pressure, promised to protect church liberties. The record emphasizes discussion and then notes approval by the greater and wiser part. That is a familiar medieval formula, and it shows that formal unanimity was not always necessary. Yet even that formula can conceal power. It can describe a true division, or it can be a polite way of saying that dissenters were irrelevant. The most concrete evidence for differentiated councils comes from a cluster of meetings in the late 1250s, called in connection with treaty provisions. Here, the records describe a rhythm. A larger council called by bell and herald. Then a narrower meeting described as special. Then another combined gathering. And finally, presentation to the full people for approval. The descriptions imply known membership. They distinguish methods of summons. The heralds call for the broader body, a more selective summons for the narrower one. They also hint at internal hierarchy by naming elders and other provident men. The meetings even shift location between different civic buildings, as if the physical space matched the political function. Voting is still lopsided, and the final approval by the assembled people is presented as unanimous. But the sequence suggests that at least sometimes Rome possessed a real mechanism, small council to shape, large council to endorse, public assembly to confirm. It is not democracy. It is managed consent. Yet it is more institutional than the simplest picture of a shouting mob. Alongside councils and assemblies stood other blurred categories: nobility and party. Notarial lists sometimes mark certain men as lords and others not, and the pattern is not random. Certain family groups receive the honorific regularly, while others do not, implying a social distinction the scribe expected readers to understand. Yet nobility in Rome is difficult to define sharply unless one restricts the term to titles granted from outside, in which case the category loses its force in city politics. Later, legal compilations list noble families and impose restrictions on baronial figures. Other regulations hint at an office-holding elite linked with public games with horses with display. There are signs of a class that rides, competes, and governs, and that expects office to follow status. Still, the caste seems to lack the clean legal boundaries seen in more tightly organised communes. Nobility is real and powerful, but its formal edges are not always visible. Party labels are no firmer. It is tempting to divide Rome between two ideological camps, but the century does not obey that map. Chroniclers sometimes describe dramatic captures of one party's leaders or portray prominent men as commanders of the other side. Yet the same names drift across the categories depending on moment and advantage. Later, Roman voices could even claim that true Romans did not belong to such parties at all, that they followed friends rather than slogans. That claim goes too far, because political leanings did exist, and some individuals did carry a recognisable aura. But overall, alliances were quick to form and quick to break. Interest often mattered more than doctrine. Party does not supply the missing solidity of Rome's institutions. To get closer to how government actually worked, attention has to return to the senator and the machinery around him. By the 13th century, the senator's old rival, the prefect, had become largely ceremonial, a hereditary ornament of a landed family. The senator, by contrast, appears both in official imagery and in daily administrative acts. Some surviving art shows him as a kneeling donor figure, dressed in the recognizable costume of office with distinctive ornaments at neck and hat, presented before sacred figures by a saint. The imagery does not explain governance, but it does show that the office was visible and prestigious, something that could be worn and displayed. The paper trail shows the senator doing what medieval governors most often did, administering justice. The work looks practical, local, and deeply connected to property. A widow might seek the return of her dower from her husband's family. Expert legal men would be summoned to advise. Their counsel would be presented, and the senator would order enforcement. Mandatories would be named. Possession would be delivered not as an abstract right, but as a list of tangible places. Land in the hills, houses in a city district, a vineyard outside a gate, the boundaries marked by neighbours, lanes, and mills. Even the senator's own family interests could sit quietly in the background, as adjacent property owners. A reminder that public authority and private network were rarely separate in this city. In such cases, Rome's government appears not as a grand constitution, but as a force that could convert claims into possession, using judges, scribes, seals, and men who physically walked someone onto land and declared it hers. In the middle of the 13th century, Roman justice did not move like a modern court, handing down a clean verdict and enforcing it on the spot. It moved through layers. A dispute could be heard by selected judges trained in the city's legal tradition, men who followed routines shaped by Roman civil law. Even when the legal reasoning was finished, the final authority still rested elsewhere. The judges often produced a written recommendation rather than a direct sentence. That recommendation then travelled upward to the senator, because the senator remained the formal source of judgment. The decisive moment was not simply what the judges concluded, but when the senator's seal turned their conclusion into an enforceable act. In theory, this created a disciplined chain of command. In practice, it could slow everything down, especially when appeals, obstruction, or plain refusal postponed the moment when paper became action. It also meant that justice could stall when key officials were away from the city, forcing later administrators to allow substitutes to issue sentences when the usual authority could not be reached. Despite the delays, one striking feature of Rome's courts was continuity. Governments changed, strongmen rose, and political styles shifted, yet older verdicts could survive the transition. The same legal officials might advise successive regimes, and the same legal opinion could follow a case across different senators. That steadiness suggests that the judiciary had its own momentum. Rome's political leadership could be unstable, but its legal machinery, at least in certain channels, kept turning. Even dramatic changes at the top did not automatically reset ongoing disputes. A widow waiting on property, a monastery protecting its holdings, or a creditor pressing a claim could still find the city's legal professionals repeating the same conclusions year after year until someone finally applied a seal and ordered enforcement. At the centre of this system stood judges, and Rome relied on them heavily. Two broad categories existed. Some were regular palace-level officials, closer to the core of government, while others were appointed for specific cases from a wider pool. Over time, the Palatine judges multiplied and specialised. Certain judges became associated with appeals, others with vulnerable groups such as widows and orphans, and others with the financial chamber of the city. The senator selected them, but outside powers could shape who entered the system. In some administrations, judges arrived from beyond Rome, reflecting the influence of rulers with external manpower and wider networks. Yet even when Rome was under strong papal control, financial records show payments that still went to Roman judges and notaries. That overlap reveals something important. Authority in Rome was rarely one clean line. Papal power could dominate politics and still share, supervise, or subsidize the city's judicial structure in an older, almost traditional manner. Around the judges stood the people who made government durable: scribes, notaries, and authorized writers. Their presence in witness lists and official acts shows a city that ran on paperwork. Agreements, oaths, votes, treaties, ratifications, and court actions were set down by named professionals, sometimes attached to the Senate, sometimes to a senator personally, sometimes to the church, and sometimes holding titles that bridged multiple worlds at once. Under foreign-backed regimes, the writing office could be expanded and divided by function. Some notaries served financial administration, some handled criminal matters, others civil disputes, others appeals. It was not a gigantic bureaucracy by modern standards, but it was organized enough to be assigned, fed, and maintained. The very fact that senior officials kept large tables and expected dozens of functionaries to eat from them is a clue to how government actually operated day to day, through households and patronage as much as through abstract institutions. The staff extended far beyond judges and notaries. City government required practical roles from bell ringers and trumpeters to banner bearers, porters, guards, and summoners. And it also required officials whose work was unglamorous, but critical. Even the management of doors mattered. If access points to the main government hall were left disorderly, it did not merely create inconvenience. It damaged the public image of authority. When a doorkeeper was appointed for life to fix notorious failures in security and decorum, the language used to justify it shows how sensitive Rome's rulers were to reputation. Shame and honour were treated as political facts. Beneath this official outline ran an even harder question. How was peace actually kept? The city used men tasked with carrying out justice and enforcing sentences, and lists of such men show a mix of local identities, neighbourhood ties, and family connections. But numbers alone do not guarantee order. In times of stronger rule, what made the difference was the ability to pay for force. A regime with access to troops and outside revenue could field mounted guards in sufficient numbers to patrol the streets. That was a major advantage. A city that scraped its budget together from tolls, rents, salt revenues, coinage rights and fines could not always sustain reliable policing. And when officials depended heavily on tips and informal payments, corruption and uneven enforcement became difficult to avoid. The most effective rulers were often those who did not need to live off the city's thin purse. Even with staff seals and guards, Roman government still feels strangely thin when examined closely. The Senate could look like the heart of civic life, and yet its shape changed constantly. Authority over the senator was never fully stable. The administration's reach could be short, and yet the community functioned. Trade continued, property changed hands, buildings rose and fell, and disputes were handled in ways people accepted as lasting. That contradiction suggests that Rome's real governing power did not come only from the Senate's formal outline. It came from the city's ability to activate specific forms of governance when pressure demanded it. One of the clearest examples appears in an office that seems almost surprising in such an environment. The masters responsible for the physical fabric of the city. These officials and their assistants regulated how people built, extended structures, blocked passageways, and disposed of waste. They acted after complaints, inspected sites, examined documents, listened to advocates, and delivered decisions in public settings on the capital, supported by witnesses and summoned participants. They could impose penalties, order removals, and direct subordinates to execute changes. If someone rejected their decision, an appeal could be taken higher. This was not vague authority. It was practical governance focused on streets, walls, access, and sanitation, the daily mechanics of urban life. Their attention repeatedly returned to the most symbolically charged zone of all, the approaches to St. Peter's. Structures that pushed into the street, porches that extended too far, and buildings that narrowed public space could become legal targets. Officials inspected with their own eyes and ordered that projections be cut back beyond an allowed limit. They also considered timing. When the papal court was present, enforcement could be postponed, because those same buildings housed people attached to the court. The city could regulate, but it also had to accommodate the realities of Rome's role as a centre of wider power. Even the cleaning of a garbage-filled lot could become a formal investigation, complete with markers identifying ownership and responsibility. The masters did not only police the sacred corridor, they dealt with dye water dumped into streets, obstructive porticos in busy districts, boundary conflicts involving religious houses, towers that threatened public space, and land questions tied to outlying territories. Their scope suggests that Rome, despite appearing loosely ruled at the top, could act with precision where daily life demanded it. The community, or at least influential parts of it, even trusted these officials enough to name them in private agreements as future arbiters. That is a strong sign of legitimacy. People expected their judgments to matter later. Other bodies echoed the same pattern. Officials connected to salt production inspected sites, deliberated, and issued decisions much like the building authorities. In moments of political crisis, assemblies of good men could appear to reshape governance and prevent collapse. Provisioning also drew in specialized roles. Rome needed stable supplies of grain and meat, and city provisioners worked to secure and distribute essentials. Yet here again, monopoly was absent. In hard times, popes could step in directly, arranging grain purchases and price controls through trusted agents connected to major institutions. The city's most intense governmental activity often reveals the same truth. Power in Rome was shared, contested, and layered. That layering was even more visible in the courts. Papal authority offered Romans alternative venues for settling disputes and validating property transfers. Delegations could be assigned to cardinals or local church officials to hear ordinary cases. Some hearings took place in strikingly public, street-level settings, with artisans and tradesmen among the witnesses, showing how legal life blended into neighbourhood life. In other moments, papal mechanisms could seize property under political religious charges and assign delegates to manage the outcomes from inside major religious complexes. Alongside courts came seals, and seals mattered. Different seals authenticated different actions, and possession of a seal was a form of power. Seen from the other side, the Senate court often appears less like a dramatic trial arena and more like a machine for turning negotiated outcomes into recognized reality. Petitions would arrive, judges would advise, and a senator's authority would be used to formalize investiture, restore boundaries, or confirm possession. The decisive work may have occurred before the court session, in bargaining and pressure, and the public act functioned as legalization, the moment when a settlement became enforceable. Even when a senator ordered an inquiry, the goal was often to recreate or reaffirm arbitration already performed, using official authority to return the situation to an accepted arrangement. Violent crime complicates the picture, because murder and property were deeply connected. Confiscation could follow homicide, and confiscated holdings could be divided and redistributed according to local statute in subject towns. Yet even in cases where punishment was real, property did not always scatter permanently. Families found ways to shield assets during seizure, or reclaim them afterward through reversals, restitutions, and later sales. A murderer might lose land on paper, see it partitioned, and still watch parts of it return to his line through later transactions. The city and its dependent territories punished, but they also lived within a landscape of negotiation and survival. In a society where violence could be frequent and where self-help still shaped behaviour, confiscation and financial penalties could sometimes serve as a more practical deterrent than a cycle of revenge killings. By the middle of the 14th century, Rome's lawmakers treated proven murder as a crime that could cost a person his life. It was placed in the same dark category as acts the city described with special disgust and fear: burning property on purpose, sexual crimes within the family, sexual violence, and the seizure of children. Yet even inside that harsh framework, the statutes reveal something more practical than rage. They were designed to reduce the spread of violence, to keep reprisals from multiplying, and to protect property from being swallowed by endless private war. The kind of murder that carried the deepest stain was still killing inside the family. Spilling the blood of one's own kin was described as an offence that outraged both heaven and human society, a violation of the one bond even a violent world expected to hold. At the same time, the laws could be selective and calculating in ways that show a government thinking like a risk manager. Some acts were punished not only for their moral weight, but for the scale of danger they threatened to unleash across neighbourhoods and factions. One example shows this logic in sharp focus. A statute from the early 1300s treated it as a capital offence to lead a dozen armed men by night to an enemy's house. Not only could the ringleader be executed, but his entire property could be seized. The numbers matter. The law assumed that 12 armed men arriving in darkness was not a private quarrel, but a spark for a larger blaze, an assault that could trigger counterattacks and drag families and allies into a wider fight. The same statute drew lines lower down the ladder. Leading a band of 6 to 11 men was still punished severely, but it did not automatically carry death, and the penalties were heavy fines rather than total ruin. Leading 2 to 5 men brought smaller penalties again. The structure of punishment was graded with a deliberate hand, as if lawmakers were trying to match sanctions to the likely social damage. Even the money collected from penalties was handled in a way that shows a sense of civic priorities. Fines could be directed toward maintaining the city walls, or divided between the city treasury and the injured party, turning punishment into both deterrence and repair. The same blend of severity and calculation appears in the way the statutes treated the property consequences of murder. The house of a murderer was not to be destroyed, unlike the property of a convicted heretic in the harsh model of inquisitorial justice. Instead, the house was to be valued, then its worth divided. 1 share for the city, 1 for the heirs of the victim. The principle seems clear. The law aimed to punish and compensate without turning punishment into uncontrolled devastation. It also set limits on coercion. Torture was restricted, permitted only in specified major crimes, a rule that suggests not softness, but a desire to keep investigation from becoming another engine of abuse and chaos. The statute book also used a familiar medieval strategy for preventing repeat offences, escalating penalties designed to block the career of the habitual criminal. Theft and robbery could move from fines to mutilation and finally to execution, each repetition bringing a sharper consequence. A second offence might cost an ear, a third a foot, and a fourth a life. The system was brutal, but it was organised. It tried to stop violence from becoming a habit that the city simply endured. Age mattered as well. A young child received special protection, and those who had passed a certain threshold but were not yet fully grown could receive reduced sentences for many crimes, though homicide stood outside this leniency. The law recognised that youth could mean diminished responsibility. Yet it also insisted that some acts were too destructive to excuse. Class, in these statutes, was not merely a social description. It was a mechanism for maintaining public order. The laws often punished more heavily as the offender climbed the social ladder. The reasoning was straightforward. When powerful people committed violence or held others unlawfully, they did more than harm individuals. They demonstrated that the strongest could act without restraint, which invited retaliation and encouraged imitation. The statutes, therefore, tried to weigh crimes by the danger posed by the offender's status. One area where this is most revealing is the matter of private prisons. An ordinary person who detained someone briefly could be fined on a modest scale. A magnate, or even a magnate's illegitimate son, who held someone for longer and refused to pay quickly, faced a far harsher tariff. The point was to cut off the habit of private justice, the kind that turns urban life into a chain of kidnappings and vendettas. Other penalties followed the same logic, almost like a table of bodily harm valued by rank. In a brawl that cost a man an eye, the fine for a commoner could be substantial, but for a knight it multiplied dramatically. Lesser injuries were also priced by class. Fingers, toes, and teeth had their assigned value, with magnates paying far more than ordinary men for the same damage. The message was not that nobles were more human, but that noble violence was more socially explosive. The law tried to force the elite to feel the cost of their blows. The legal system's sensitivity to hierarchy becomes even more striking in its treatment of official dishonesty. False testimony was punished, but the most revealing target was the notary, who produced a forged document. That crime struck at the city's written memory and at the credibility of contracts, dowries, leases, and every kind of property arrangement. The statutes treated forgery as a threat to the entire system of peaceful exchange. Here too, penalties rose by class. The fines could become enormous for the highest ranks. Failure to pay within a set term could mean the loss of the right hand, the tool of both craft and identity. Conviction could also permanently bar a notary from practice. The legal imagination behind this is easy to see. Once the trustworthiness of documents collapses, property disputes stop being managed by courts and return to force. Nothing in these rules suggests a quiet city. The statutes themselves are proof of how common violence was, down to the petty acts that fill streets and churches with tension. There were fines for shooting arrows or throwing stones in churches with glass windows. There were fines for crude gestures, for insults, for deliberately throwing someone to the ground, for threatening with a hand on a knife. There were penalties for stone throwing, for leaving a visible scar on the face, for knocking out teeth, for forcing filth into someone's mouth. The law even priced humiliation. Some offences were not about economic loss, but about public shaming that could ignite feuds. There were also rules against building private fortifications meant to disturb the city's peace, suggesting that political conflict could harden into small-scale urban warfare with barricades and strong points. These statutes survive from the 14th century, rather than the 13th, and they were collected later than many legal compilations in nearby towns. Yet much of what they describe likely reflects older habits. Some older family powers, such as the severe authority a father could exercise within the household, may have been even more pronounced in the earlier century, when external institutions of support were thinner. Other concerns are harder to place. Restrictions aimed at gambling, shop closing rules, limits on taverns, controls on food sales, public regulations about fishing rights. Some of these may have intensified as the century changed. The city's own messiness certainly remained visible. The statutes contain rules that make Rome feel like a place where animals wandered through streets, and danger could arrive from unexpected directions. Anyone keeping pigs inside the city was ordered to pen them so they would not roam. Wolves and other ferocious beasts were treated as real threats, and bounties were offered for killing them within the walls and outside. It is possible to imagine such problems increasing after the papal court left Italy. But it is equally possible that the city had always carried a half-wild edge, with livestock, refuse, and predators slipping into the gaps of weak enforcement. Seen together, the laws create a picture of a rough, irregular Rome a century after the mid-13th century. A city where violence could be political or personal, where noble feuds and street-level aggression coexisted, and where government tried to answer both with a mixture of terror, calculation, and routine policing. Even intimate life came under regulation. The law tried to manage disputes over sex and marriage by setting limits on timing and on who could accuse in certain cases, as if to prevent private scandal from becoming a weapon without restraint. It laid out a ladder of penalties for desertion, with incentives for informers, designed to force husbands back into their households and to discourage them from living openly with concubines. The legal mind is visible here too. Keep households stable, because unstable households spill into unstable streets. Counterfeit husbands and counterfeit coin were both treated as threats, but the contrast in punishment exposed the hierarchy of fear. A domestic deceiver might face a fine. A coin forger might face death. The city was defending its social fabric, but it was also defending the currency of trust that made commerce possible. When Roman government is described through the lens of property, this violence must remain in view. It threatened property, which was reason enough for rulers and elites to dislike it. Yet violence was also entangled with property in deeper ways. On the largest scale, it was funded and armed by landholding power in the countryside. Violence fought to control office, and office controlled the distribution of advantage, privileges, and decisions. Violence also aimed at the wider prize: influence within the city's government and access to the wealth that flowed through the papal court. A key task of government in this environment was arbitration between competing forces, not merely punishing criminals after the fact, but reducing the incentive for continual conflict. In a city where authority was layered and sometimes fragmented, the job often became persuading the powerful to recognize their own interest in restraint. That process is not unique to Rome, but Rome makes it easier to see because there was often so little heavy institutional structure to hide the bargaining underneath. The city's real life shows itself in cases, rulings, and negotiated settlements, where peace depended less on abstract justice than on the parties' willingness to accept a workable compromise. One dispute from the late 1230s illustrates what governance looked like on the ground. Two religious communities owned watermills in the countryside at the same place, drawing from the same watercourse. The practical problem was simple and endless. One set of repairs and new construction affected the flow for the other, and a conflict over damages, costs, and rights became unavoidable. The parties could not settle among themselves, so the dispute was brought before a powerful church official acting as judge and arbiter. The case turned on engineering as much as law: how to guide, split, and rejoin the water so both mills could function efficiently without harming each other, and how to partition interest in a mill still under construction. The parties agreed to accept the arbiter's decision and bound themselves with a heavy penalty if they refused to comply. The arbiter established general terms, then required further definition by two master masons chosen by both sides. The compromise was pronounced in a Roman church, witnessed by a small and varied circle. Representatives of the parties, churchmen, household attendants, and figures from outside Rome. This scene is almost a miniature of what government often meant in Rome. It meant providing a recognized forum where the powerful could settle disputes without turning them into a feud. It meant creating legitimacy and permanence through procedure, record, and witness. It meant using expertise, like the master masons, not as decoration, but as a tool for making compromise workable. Above all, it meant translating raw power and contested possession into an agreement the parties could live with, because it served their interests better than open conflict. In form, arbitration differs from judgment, but the underlying reality can be similar. A court might issue a decisive ruling, yet even a ruling backed by an external ruler's authority could be hard to enforce if it did not match local realities of possession and influence. Authority could supply seals, orders, officials, and formal commands. It could supply memory in writing, but lasting force often depended on acceptance. A settlement had to be something the parties found it safer to obey than to reject. For that reason, the line between arbitration and judgment could blur. One case might look like a clean victory on paper, while the real compromise took place off-stage in negotiations that never reached the record. Another case might openly embrace compromise because both sides knew neither could impose a total solution without risking worse losses. Rome's layered authorities could even become an advantage to its inhabitants. Multiple courts and multiple routes to a formal decision meant room to maneuver. Instead of being trapped under a single rigid jurisdiction, parties could choose the forum best suited to their strategy, or at least the forum most likely to produce a settlement they could enforce. What might appear as confused governance could function as flexibility. Romans did not necessarily need to feel lost in the presence of different supervising powers. They needed an authority capable of recording a settlement, lending it legitimacy, and providing a framework for enforcement. The deeper work still lay with the parties themselves, weighing their power, calculating their interest, and accepting terms that avoided destruction. In this sense, the statute book itself reads like a manual for self-government. It did not invent every norm it enforced. It often codified practices already familiar in contracts and local custom. It protected landlords against fraudulent release from vineyard leases, echoing language found in countless agreements. It fought public filth, with fines aimed at ordinary behaviour, with special attention to butchers and waste, and it relied on informers by awarding them a share of the penalty. This was governance as a small machine. Rules, fines, incentives, and a citizenry encouraged to police itself. Rome, however, had its own peculiar economic foundations, and these shaped the kind of government it required. The city's prosperity did not depend primarily on large-scale manufacturing, in the way some other communes did. Much of its life fed off more unusual streams, pilgrims and the papal court. Money flowed in through lodgings, purchases, rents, donations, and the countless expenses generated by visiting litigants, petitioners, diplomats, and clerical households. In that economy, protecting visitors became a civic interest, and government could appear as a voice warning locals not to let greed turn into predation that would drive foreigners away. A senatorial proclamation aimed at safeguarding pilgrims makes this clear. It framed regulations as serving both the tranquility of inhabitants and the comfort of those who came to the city in devotion. It targeted a specific abuse: lodging keepers near the Great Basilica forcing travellers into their houses, even dragging away pilgrims already settled elsewhere. The message was not sentimental hospitality. It was controlled hospitality. Visitors were to lodge where they chose and buy what they needed where they wished, under civic protection, because the city's welfare depended on it. Greed had to be disciplined, so that it could continue to be satisfied. This also helps explain why Rome's political structure did not always need the hard institutional shape typical of other urban communes. A flexible income could be met with a flexible system. Government could flare into firmness when necessary, then fall back into looseness without collapsing entirely. At moments, documents reveal a crust of organised offices and specialised roles, and then that crust disappears again beneath the city's more fluid habits. What remains consistent is the sense that, when Rome acted effectively, it acted where its economic needs demanded it, keeping the streets usable, controlling fraud, managing provisioning, preventing visitor exploitation, and mediating disputes over land and rent. The presence of the Pope mattered enormously in this system, and Romans often understood that with blunt clarity. Calling the Pope to Rome, protecting him, insisting on his presence, these acts were not only about devotion or ideology, they were also about economic survival. When the papal court stayed away, rents fell. When it returned, money moved again. The papacy hung over the city like a shadow, sometimes dark and overbearing, especially at the end of the 13th century, when a senator could publicly style himself first as the Pope's relative and only second as the city's official. Yet even that dominance can look different when the papacy is seen as one of the city's largest financial assets, a generator of demand like a mine, a market, or a port. The Pope's power over Rome was partly rooted in the advantage his presence brought. He was also one man who could die, and Rome's politics repeatedly reveal how quickly a death could reshuffle factions and fortunes. So the question returns: who ruled Rome? The most honest answer is that rule was shared by a shifting complex of forces: land, offices, family power, civic habits, and sacred authority. Urban government, papal influence, and noble factions all mattered. Yet the strongest constant behind the shifting forms was money, the daily circulation of small coins, rents, fines and purchases, the flow of profit from pilgrims and from the court, the struggle to control offices that distributed advantage, and the effort to keep violence from ruining the conditions under which wealth could be gathered. In that light, Rome's rulers can be imagined not only as popes and barons and senators, but as the pressure of profit itself, always present, always shaping decisions and often commanding obedience more effectively than any single person. Power in the high Middle Ages was not only held, it was performed. An office came with a script that people across Europe recognized. When a man became archbishop, king, or pope, he stepped into a role larger than his upbringing, larger than his hometown, sometimes even larger than his personality. The point was not to appear ordinary. The point was to embody something that felt ancient, authoritative, and almost theatrical. That public awareness of role could be seen at moments of crisis, at altars and in palaces, in courts and on city streets, when leaders acted as if the world were watching because, in a very real sense, it was. This culture of role helps explain why 13th century rulers often seem to exceed the limits of their origins. The office itself supplied confidence and language, and it offered a model of how greatness should look. Some men grew into that model so completely that their personal background almost vanished behind the mask of the job. And yet, the mask did not erase family. It often carried family upward. In Rome especially, high office could lift a clan, protect a network, and turn private ambition into public authority. The popes chosen in the 13th century were usually not young conquerors, bursting into power. More often they were older churchmen shaped by years of administration, negotiation, and diplomacy. They were insiders, trained in law and procedure, familiar with how to manage conflict, how to speak in a formal register, and how to survive the pressure of factions. Most were Italian, and a striking number came from Rome and its surrounding countryside. That mattered. It meant the papacy was not only a spiritual institution with universal claims. It was also connected to local landscapes, local families, and local rivalries that did not disappear just because a man put on a white robe. Across the century, the rhythm of papal reigns was uneven. Long pontificates clustered early, while later decades saw quicker turnover. Certain families dominated for extended stretches, not by ruling every year, but by returning again and again through different individuals, alliances, and client relationships. A small group of Roman houses repeatedly placed someone near the summit, even when a pope himself was not born into one of these dynasties. He could be closely tied to them through patronage and dependence. The result was a papacy that often looked like a European monarchy in miniature. Universal in theory, deeply local in its mechanisms. Not every powerful papal family was Roman. One prominent northern lineage produced popes who were talented, well-connected and wealthy, yet lacked the local foundation to turn papal success into a lasting territorial dynasty in Rome itself. Their influence could travel in different ways, through appointments, church titles, and the placement of loyal men, but their roots were not planted in the Roman countryside the way the dominant local family's roots were. That difference exposed something central about the age. Papal power was immense, but it did not automatically become durable family control unless it rested on a local base of land, clients, and entrenched relationships. For all the grandeur of the papal role, the period also carried a chronic flaw that contemporaries recognized and condemned: the pull of kinship. Favouring relatives was not an occasional weakness. It was a structural temptation. Wealth and office flowed toward nephews, cousins, and allied houses. Even admirers could imagine how much greater a pope might have been if he had not been surrounded by hungry dependents. Critics went further and treated family favoritism as a betrayal of the very holiness the office claimed to represent. Among the century's popes, the early master of the role appears as a figure of energy and clarity. He is remembered as someone who believed problems could be solved, confusion could be cut through, and the world could be pushed toward order by decision and action. He behaved like a man convinced that responsibility was not a burden to escape, but a task to seize. His confidence made him practical, sometimes severe, often effective. He moved quickly, judged boldly, and carried himself as if the office demanded not caution, but command. That same drive could be seen in the way he approached governance. He acted as if the job required constant attention, hearings, decisions, reforms, intervention in disputes, a steady pressure toward discipline. He cultivated learning, valued law, and treated administration as a serious craft. He could also be blunt. In a courtroom or council setting, he did not hesitate to cut down arguments he found tedious or performative. His authority allowed him wit, and his wit served his authority. Yet the brilliance of such a ruler was not only administrative, it was also rhetorical. The papal court of this era lived in words. Sermons, letters, decrees, public statements, symbolic gestures. The papacy's power depended on being heard and understood. This is why the office attracted, and sometimes produced, men who loved language, who could turn phrases, who could mix solemnity with sharp humour, and who could make official documents sound like events. In that culture, style was not decoration. It was part of rule. The century's end presents a darker picture of what the papal role could become when ambition hardened and restraint failed. The last major pope of the era stands in the record not only as a statesman, but as a man surrounded by accusations so extreme that they force a difficult question. What do such stories reveal, even when they are politically weaponized? Some testimony from the aftermath of his fall reads like an attempt to build a monster. It piles detail upon detail. Rooms, garments, gestures, conversations, insults. The purpose is obvious. The credibility is contested. And yet, the portrait has a strange coherence. It depicts a ruler who dominates through ridicule, who humiliates opponents with a sharp tongue, who treats moral boundaries as negotiable, and who speaks as if power itself were the only reality worth acknowledging. In this portrait, the papal palace feels less like a sacred court and more like an enclosed stage where intimidation and intimacy become tools. The stories linger on private scenes. Sudden commands, crude jokes, contemptuous retorts, the casual dismissal of fasting, sanctity, and even the idea of another life beyond this one. Whether every element is true is not the only issue. What matters is that such an image could circulate and persuade, because it matched what many already feared. That the most magnificent office in Europe could be filled by a man who used it as a weapon for personal domination and family expansion. The political context sharpened the scandal. This pope's final years were marked by bitter conflict with major rivals and by a violent confrontation that ended not in a calm transfer of power, but in public humiliation and collapse. After his death, his enemies tried to transform political war into moral prosecution, framing him as not merely corrupt, but fundamentally illegitimate. The trial narrative, even when treated with caution, shows how fragile reputations were and how easily the sacred could be dragged into the language of the obscene. The contrast between the early energetic reformer and the later embattled ruler is not simply a contrast of personalities. It is a contrast of what the papal role made possible. At its best, the office could produce discipline, coherence, and enormous creative force. At its worst, it could amplify cruelty, greed, and delusion. In both cases, the role did not erase family. It carried family along, sometimes lifting local houses into European significance, sometimes turning private ambition into public policy. And that is the paradox at the heart of 13th century Rome. A city and a church capable of universal language, yet constantly tugged by local loyalties. An office that claimed spiritual authority, yet operated through political technique. Leaders who could transcend their origins through the sheer power of role, yet who often remained bound to the oldest human reflex of all, the instinct to protect and enrich their own. The figure of Boniface appears deeply tragic when his life is viewed closely. Despite standing at the summit of the universal church, commanding immense authority and possessing remarkable intelligence and political skill, he seems marked by an intense inner loneliness. When two nephews whom he loved dearly died, he is said to have asked what reason he still had to live. This moment reveals a powerful ruler whose personal grief broke through the grandeur of his position. He embodied the highest claims of papal authority and expressed the Church's most sweeping vision of power. Yet, he gives the impression of a man enclosed within a religious system that did not entirely belong to him. He was surrounded by the full ceremonial weight of Christianity, its symbols, relics, treasures, and sacred objects. Yet these elements appear to have pressed upon him, rather than sustained him. The immense papal treasury overflowed with sacred items, but their abundance seemed to drain them of spiritual meaning. Ritual splendor risked becoming an empty display. This tension gives Boniface's life a tragic dimension. His dignity and commanding presence made the drama of his career more intense. His image, captured in sculpture in Florence, shows a figure of imposing authority and solemn confidence. The famous episode at Anagni, retold countless times, captures this sense of grandeur facing collapse. The elderly pontiff, seated upon his throne in full ceremonial dress, wearing the papal crown and holding the golden cross, awaited his enemies and perhaps his death with deliberate composure. Accounts describe him clinging to his symbol of authority even in physical weakness, maintaining the posture of spiritual sovereignty at the moment of political humiliation. In another episode, far less dignified but equally revealing, an earthquake interrupted a religious service, and the Pope fled in fear from the cathedral and from the Mass itself. This scene, stripped of ceremony, shows a man vulnerable and uncertain, exposed beneath the layers of religious authority. The image of Boniface inevitably recalls an earlier pope, Innocent III. Both men stood at the centre of the century's great struggles over spiritual and political authority. Innocent represented the confident beginning of an era, Boniface its troubled conclusion. The contrast between them is striking. Innocent defined the central doctrines of the Church with calm assurance and authority, presenting a clear vision of orthodoxy. Boniface, by contrast, appears surrounded by controversy, suspicion, and accusations of cynicism. Where Innocent seemed untroubled by doubt, Boniface appears marked by disillusionment. The century that separated them witnessed not a simple decline, but a transformation in the nature of papal authority and in the expectations placed upon the office. Yet the history of the 13th century papacy cannot be reduced to a single pattern moving from strength to decay. Several popes of the period resist such easy classification. Gregory X embodied spiritual devotion and sought unity within Christianity, dreaming of reconciliation between the Eastern and Western churches. Clement IV pursued political goals shaped by national loyalties. Other figures, diplomatic, ascetic, or even ineffective, reflect the wide variety of personalities who occupied the papal throne. What does emerge as a consistent theme is the growing importance of family power, factional interests, and territorial influence. Many popes promoted their relatives and strengthened their family's position, blending spiritual authority with dynastic ambition. Another important change in the century concerned the nature of the pope's personal presence. Earlier popes, such as Innocent III, ruled visibly and directly, holding audiences and engaging personally with visitors and officials. Over time, however, the papacy became increasingly surrounded by layers of administration. By the later 13th century, the Pope appeared more distant, screened by cardinals, advisors, and an expanding bureaucracy. The individual personality of the ruler became less visible as institutional structures grew stronger. Authority was expressed through official formulas, documents, and procedures rather than personal contact. The office itself became more impersonal. Boniface's dramatic behaviour may partly be understood as a reaction against this process. His elaborate ceremonies, his striking gestures, and the extravagant stories told about him reflect a struggle to assert personal authority within a system that increasingly reduced the individual to a function of the institution. As government and society developed more complex administrative forms, personal leadership lost some of its earlier heroic character. The age of strongly individualized rulers had given way to a new form of political organization, dominated by institutions rather than personalities. This transformation affected more than government alone. Social roles throughout medieval society were shifting. Traditional images of warriors, monks, and leaders were being reshaped by new realities. In this changing world, Boniface can be seen as a figure struggling to maintain a sense of personal power and identity. His public monuments and representations, commissioned during his lifetime, reveal an intense concern with authority, status, and recognition. At the same time, Boniface can also be understood in a more practical and material sense as Benedetto Caetani, a member of a powerful family and a holder of extensive landed property. Records of his estates show a man deeply involved in acquiring lands, rents, vineyards, and fields. Through these holdings, he became part of the social and economic structure that bound communities together. Like many great landlords, his personal ambitions served broader economic functions, organizing production and reinforcing social connections among tenants and dependents. His pursuit of property, especially his extensive purchases for his family, reflects both personal ambition and the wider dynamics of medieval landholding. The papacy itself required constant movement and enormous resources. Popes frequently resided in different cities, travelling with a vast court of officials, servants, and administrators. Financial records reveal the scale of this operation. Enormous sums were spent on food, materials, transportation, ceremonial objects, and daily necessities. Supplies ranged from fish and meat to candles, textiles, and precious materials used for official documents. Residences required maintenance, furnishings, and decoration. Even seemingly minor items, such as fabrics for curtains or pearls for ornamentation, formed part of the elaborate system that sustained the papal household. These expenditures were not merely personal extravagance. The papacy was expected to embody splendour. The magnificence of ceremonies, buildings, and processions served to represent the authority and dignity of the Church. Rome itself functioned as a stage for religious display, and the Pope stood at the centre of these public spectacles. The office demanded visible grandeur as part of its symbolic power. Even more modest popes shared this sense of responsibility. Detailed accounts show spending on church decoration, building repairs, charitable distributions, and public ceremonies. Funds were allocated for maintaining sacred objects, supporting clergy, feeding the poor, and sustaining religious institutions. The distribution of resources reveals a conception of authority that combined spiritual duty, public display, and social responsibility. The papal court formed a vast and complex environment. It attracted merchants, craftsmen, lawyers, and clerks, creating an entire urban economy around its presence. At its centre stood the College of Cardinals, whose council was essential to papal decision-making. The Pope, though supreme in theory, operated within a network of advisors and administrators who shaped policy and governance. Beneath them functioned an extensive bureaucracy of offices and courts, each with established procedures and routines. In such a system, the individual ruler risked becoming merely a symbol of authority rather than an independent actor. The tension between personal authority and institutional structure helps explain the contradictions in Boniface's behaviour. He sought to assert his individuality within a system that reduced him to ceremonial functions and administrative processes. The papal office could transform a living person into a symbol, a seal, a crown, a representation of authority rather than a human being. A clearer understanding of the papacy emerges when examining other figures of the period. Nicholas III, for example, appeared vividly in the memory of his contemporaries. He was recognised as a capable ruler, attentive to administrative matters, devoted to religious orders, and deeply committed to strengthening his family's influence. His actions combined political prudence with personal ambition, reflecting the complex nature of papal leadership. Innocent IV represents another model of papal authority. Highly educated and intellectually rigorous, he was renowned for his legal scholarship and administrative skill. Much of his energy was devoted to conflict with the Emperor Frederick II, a struggle that shaped his papacy. His actions reflected the assumptions and limitations of his time. He believed it necessary to defend the Church's authority, even through violent conflict, and pursued this goal with determination. His policies contributed to broader transformations in the nature of papal power, reinforcing the political and institutional dimensions of the office. Despite his abilities, Innocent remained constrained by the structure of the papacy itself. The office demanded adherence to established procedures and traditional forms of governance. Even a brilliant leader operated within a system that shaped and limited individual action. His authority extended across Christendom, yet his direct influence over Rome itself could be surprisingly limited. The Pope was often more a universal figure than a local ruler, connected to Rome, yet not fully rooted in its political life. From one perspective, the Pope could appear distant, even alien within the city that hosted his court. From another perspective, however, a Roman who attained the papacy represented extraordinary success, elevating his family and securing lasting wealth and influence. The papacy thus embodied both universal authority and local ambition, combining spiritual leadership with social and economic power. Through these figures and developments, the 13th century reveals a papacy shaped by tension between personal belief and public authority, between spiritual mission and political ambition, between individual leadership and institutional structure. The lives of these popes reflect the complex transformation of medieval society itself, as traditional forms of authority gave way to new systems of governance and new understandings of power.